Nathan Cole slammed his fist on the long oak table so hard the untouched plate jumped and cracked down the middle. "Get out!" he snarled at the trembling young woman standing in his kitchen doorway. "I don't need another applicant who came here to marry my money instead of cook my meals." The woman fled without a word. Nathan stood alone in the silence he'd built for 6 long years until 3 days later, a widow with a broken suitcase and a stubborn set to her jaw walked 3 miles in the heat and refused to leave his gate. Before you find out how she cracked open a heart that grief had sealed shut, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and comment the city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I can't wait to see how far across the country this story travels. The plate cracked clean down the middle, and the sound of it was the loudest thing that had happened in that house in 6 years. Nathan Cole stood at the head of his own table, breathing hard, staring at the young woman who had come from town that morning with a letter of introduction from her aunt and a head full of ideas about what it meant to marry a rich man. She had spent 20 minutes talking about herself and not once asked him what he wanted for supper. "I don't need another applicant who came here to marry my money instead of cook my meals," Nathan said, and his voice was low and rough, like something dragged over gravel. "Get out." She left crying. He didn't chase after her to apologize. He never did. Tom Baker, his foreman, stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, watching the whole thing from the hall. He'd worked for Nathan Cole for 11 years, since before the wedding, since before the sickness, since before the silence moved into the house like a permanent tenant. He knew better than most men alive when to speak and when to hold his tongue. He held it a good long while before he finally said something. "That's the 4th one this month, Nathan." "Then I'll interview a 5th. You scared her clean off the porch. Good." Nathan sat down hard in his chair, the one at the head of the table, the one that had always been his, even when there'd been a woman sitting across from him, filling the second chair with laughter. He looked at the empty seat across from him now. He looked at it the way a man looks at a grave he still isn't sure he believes is real. "I don't want a wife, Tom. I had one. I buried her. I want a cook who can make a decent stew and mind her own business. Ain't a crime to want company, too. Didn't ask your opinion." Tom nodded slow, the way he always did when he was choosing not to argue with a man who wasn't in the mood to be argued with. "No, sir, you didn't." He turned to go, then stopped in the doorway, hat still in his hands. "Elizabeth wouldn't want this house to stay this quiet forever. You know that." Nathan didn't answer. He stared at the cracked plate until Tom's boots faded down the hall, and then he sat there a long while in a dining room built for a family that had shrunk down to 1 man and an empty chair. He remembered the day he'd married Elizabeth in that same room, before it was a dining room, back when it was still just a house half built and full of promises. He remembered her laugh, sharp and bright, the kind of laugh that made ranch hands smile even from across the yard. He remembered the fever that took her in 4 days flat so fast the doctor barely had time to ride out from town before it was over. 6 years now. 6 years, and Nathan Cole still set 2 cups out of habit some mornings before he caught himself and put the second one away. He was the richest man in the county and the loneliest man in Montana Territory, and everybody in town knew it, and nobody dared say it to his face. The next morning, Nathan rode into town himself instead of sending Tom, which was unusual enough that half the men outside the feed store turned their heads to watch him pass. He tied his horse outside the general store and walked in with his jaw set hard. "Another advertisement, Mr. Cole?" asked Sarah Higgins, who ran the counter and knew the business of every family within 20 miles, whether they wanted her to or not. "Same as before." He slid a coin across the counter. "Wanted a cook for Cole Ranch. Honest work. Fair wages. No unnecessary questions." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but didn't say what she was thinking, which was that a lonely rich widower posting cook advertisements every few weeks was the worst-kept secret in 3 counties. "I'll pin it up right now." Obliged. Nathan was already turning to leave when the bell over the door rang, and a woman walked out from the back room. Mrs. Colleen Ford, wife of the biggest landowner in town besides Nathan himself. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, like a woman evaluating a horse she was thinking of buying. "Mr. Cole, still can't keep help out at that big house of yours." "Ma'am, you know my niece is looking for a position. Pretty girl, good family." "I'm sure she is." Nathan touched the brim of his hat and walked straight past her out the door, because he'd had that conversation 11 times in 6 years, and he knew exactly how it ended with some woman's relative showing up at his ranch, more interested in his bank account than his supper table. He rode home with his jaw still tight, and for 3 days, nobody came. On the 4th day, a young widow named Betsy Larkin showed up, asking about the position, and she lasted exactly one look at the size of Nathan's kitchen before she turned pale and said she didn't think she was suited for a house that grand, and left without even taking off her bonnet. On the 6th day, a woman named Prudence Dale showed up in a dress too fine for cooking work and spent the entire interview asking Nathan about the size of his herd and whether the house had indoor plumbing, and Nathan showed her the door before she finished her second question. By the 9th day, Nathan Cole had stopped believing anybody decent was coming, and he told Tom as much, over breakfast eating cold biscuits alone at a table built for 8. "Maybe you're asking the wrong kind of question in that advertisement," Tom said, chewing slow. "I'm asking for a cook." "You're asking for a cook the way a man asks for a wife he don't want to admit he's looking for. Women can smell that a mile off, Nathan. The desperate ones come running for the money, and the decent ones get scared off because they think you're looking for something they ain't willing to give." Nathan set his coffee down harder than he meant to. "I ain't looking for anything but a hot supper and a quiet house." "Then maybe you ought to stop hiring people who want to be more than that and start hiring somebody who just wants honest work." Nathan didn't answer, but something in what Tom said stuck with him through the morning chores, needling at him, while he checked fence lines with young Eli Parker, the newest and youngest hand on the ranch, a boy of 19 who flinched every time Nathan raised his voice and apologized for things that weren't his fault. "Sorry, Mr. Cole," Eli said for the 3rd time that morning after dropping a coil of wire he was supposed to be carrying. "Nothing to be sorry for. Pick it up." "Yes, sir." Eli scrambled for the wire, hands shaking slightly, and Nathan watched him with something that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite pity. Just a tired recognition of a boy who'd been told too many times in his life that he wasn't good enough. Nathan had been that boy once, a long time before he was rich, before his father struck it lucky with cattle prices and built an empire out of dirt and stubbornness. He remembered what it felt like to be looked at like you were less than you were. "You're not useless, boy," Nathan said, more gruff than gentle, but Eli's head came up fast, surprised. "Quit acting like you are." Eli didn't say anything, but something in his shoulders straightened just a little, and Nathan turned his horse back toward the house before the moment could turn into more conversation than either of them wanted. It was 2 days after that when Clara Whitmore walked through the front gate of Cole Ranch, carrying a suitcase held together with rope, and everything in Nathan's carefully guarded, carefully silent life started to come apart. He was standing on the porch when he saw her coming up the long dirt road, a small figure growing larger against the flat, dry land, walking steady, despite the heat that had every sensible person in the county sitting indoors with the shades drawn. Nathan watched her for a full minute before he realized she wasn't turning back the way the others had. She kept walking straight up the road, straight to his gate, and only stopped when she reached the bottom of his porch steps. She was younger than he expected, and older than she looked, somewhere near 30, with a face that had clearly known hard years and hadn't let them win. Her dress was clean, but mended in 3 places he could see from where he stood. Her boots were worn thin at the heel, and her eyes, Nathan noticed this even from the porch, her eyes had the particular tired weight of someone who had buried something they loved and kept walking anyway. "Afternoon?" she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected, from someone who'd clearly walked a long way in brutal heat. "I'm here about the cooking position." Nathan came down 2 steps and stopped looking at her, the way he'd looked at every applicant before her, searching for the greed, the calculation, the hunger for something more than honest wages. He didn't find it. That unsettled him more than if he had. "You walked here?" he asked. "Yes. From town. That's near 3 miles. "I'm aware of the distance, Mr. Cole. There was no complaint in it, no request for pity, just a plain statement of fact that made Nathan's mouth twitch almost a smile, the first one that had threatened his face in longer than he wanted to admit. In this heat. The heat doesn't much care whether I walk in it or sit in it, she said. I'd rather be doing something useful. Nathan studied her a moment longer. Why? Something flickered across her face, not weakness, but the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from answering a question too many times. Because I needed a place where my work mattered, and I heard you needed a cook and I can cook. Lots of women say that. Lots of women haven't fed a husband and 4 hired hands through 2 bad winters on nothing but what they could grow and preserve themselves. Her chin lifted slightly. I'm not lots of women, Mr. Cole. I'm hungry, and I'm honest, and I'll work harder than anyone else who's walked up that road because I don't have anywhere else to walk to. Nathan felt something in his chest shift, a small crack in a wall he'd spent 6 years reinforcing. He didn't like it. He didn't trust it. But he found himself asking another question instead of sending her away. What happened to your husband? Fever took him this past winter, same as it took most everything else we had. She said it flat without asking for sympathy, the way a person says something they've made peace with saying out loud, even if they haven't made peace with the thing itself. I sold what I could. Buried him next to his mother. Walked to the next town where there might be work. This is the 3rd ranch I've asked at this month. The other 2 didn't need a cook. One offered me a different kind of position. Her jaw tightened just slightly. I declined. Nathan understood exactly what she meant, and something ugly moved through him on her behalf, an anger he hadn't felt in years because he hadn't cared about much of anything in years. That man have a name. Doesn't matter now. I'm not looking for anyone to fight my battles, Mr. Cole. I'm looking for honest wages for honest work. She glanced past him at the house, the big empty house with its dark windows and quiet porch. That's a large kitchen you must have in there. Big enough. Big enough for a family that isn't using it from the look of things. Nathan's face closed up fast the way it always did when anyone got too close to the truth of his life. That's none of your concern if you're only here to cook. No, sir. Clara said, unbothered by his sharpness, like she'd weathered worse from men who had far less reason to be short with her. It isn't. I apologize. She didn't sound like she was apologizing. She sounded like a woman stating a fact she wasn't going to lose sleep over. And that more than anything else, more than the walk, more than the steady eyes, more than the dead husband and the mended dress, was the thing that made Nathan Cole step back from the porch and open the gate wider instead of closing it. I pay $8 a week, he said. Room above the kitchen. You keep the house running, keep meals on the table, and you don't ask me questions about things that aren't your business. That's more than fair. There's rules. I expected there would be. I eat alone. I don't want conversation at the table. I don't want anybody poking around rooms that stay closed. He hesitated, and something in his voice roughened when he said the next part. There's a room upstairs. It stays locked. Nobody goes in there. Not you, not the hands, not anybody. Clara looked at him steady, and Nathan had the uncomfortable sensation that she understood exactly what kind of room that was and exactly why it stayed locked without him having to explain a single word of it. Understood, Mr. Cole. Nathan, he said before he could stop himself, and then immediately felt foolish for it. Mr. Cole is fine too. Whatever you're comfortable with. Mr. Cole then, for now. The faintest curve touched her mouth, gone almost before it arrived. When do you want me to start? Nathan looked at the suitcase in her hand, the rope holding it together, the worn boots, the steady eyes that hadn't once asked him for pity or money or anything beyond a fair wage for honest work. He thought about the cracked plate from 3 days before the 4th failed applicant that week, Tom's words about asking the wrong kind of question. Kitchen's a mess, he said finally. Nobody's used it proper in years. Then I suppose I'd best get started today. She walked past him up the porch steps before he could think of a reason to stop her. And Nathan Cole stood there a long moment in the heat, watching the door swing shut behind a stranger who had just walked into his house and his life carrying nothing but a broken suitcase and more dignity than anyone he'd met in years. He didn't know it yet, standing there, but the house was never going to be silent again. Clara Whitmore found the kitchen exactly as bad as Nathan had warned her, and somehow worse than she'd imagined. The stove hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The shelves held more dust than food. A layer of neglect coated every surface, not from filth, but from disuse, the particular kind of decay that settles over a room nobody cares enough to enter. She set her suitcase down in the corner and got to work before she'd even asked where her room was. By evening, she'd scrubbed the stove clean, swept the floor twice, and found enough usable stores in the pantry and the root cellar to put together a meal. She didn't ask Nathan for guidance. She didn't need it. She moved through the kitchen like a woman who had cooked in worse conditions with less to work with because she had. Tom Baker found her there around supper time, humming low under her breath while she worked, and stopped dead in the doorway. "Lord Almighty," he said, "is that bread I smell?" "It will be if you give it another 20 minutes. Clara didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. "You must be Mr. Baker. Mr. Cole mentioned you'd be eating with the hands separately. 11 years I've worked this ranch, and I don't believe this kitchen has smelled like bread the whole time." Tom leaned against the doorframe, studying her with open curiosity. "You the new cook?" "Clara Whitmore. Started an hour ago." "Well, Miss Whitmore, on behalf of every hungry man on this ranch, I thank you kindly." He tipped his hat, genuine warmth in it, the kind of easy friendliness that came natural to him, and had been sorely missing from Cole Ranch for longer than he cared to admit. "You need anything, you holler. Kitchen's been needing a woman's hand a long while now. I noticed." Clara finally looked up, and something in Tom's open face seemed to put her at ease in a way Nathan's guarded silence hadn't. "Is he always so short with people, Mr. Cole?" Tom considered the question a moment, weighing how much to say to a woman who'd been on the ranch less than 2 hours. "He wasn't always. Lost his wife some years back. Grief does strange things to a man who don't know how to let it out proper. He ain't cruel, Miss Whitmore. Just closed up tight as a jar nobody's opened in years." Clara absorbed them without comment and went back to stirring her pot. But something in her expression had shifted, softened just slightly, the way a person's face changes when a stranger's sharpness suddenly makes more sense. That evening, Nathan sat down at the long table alone, same as he had every evening for 6 years, and found a plate waiting for him that smelled like something he hadn't smelled in longer than he wanted to count. Fresh bread. A simple beef stew. Nothing fancy, seasoned careful and cooked slow. A small dish of stewed apples on the side. He sat there a moment before he picked up his fork, half expecting the food to taste the way everything had tasted for 6 years, like obligation, like something he ate because his body required it, and not because he wanted it. The first bite undid something in him he hadn't expected to feel undone. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't the kind of meal a rich man's money could simply purchase from any competent cook in the territory. It was the kind of meal made by someone who understood that food could be an act of care, who had put something of herself into the seasoning and the timing, and the careful attention that no amount of money could buy if the person cooking didn't mean it. It tasted like a kitchen that used to have a woman in it who loved him. Nathan sat very still for a long moment, fork halfway to his mouth, and had to work hard to keep his face from showing anything at all. He finished the meal in silence, every bite of it, and when he was done, he sat there staring at the empty plate, the way he'd stared at the cracked one 3 days before, except this time the feeling in his chest was entirely different. Clara came to clear the table a few minutes later and found him still sitting there. "Was it not to your liking, Mr. Cole?" "It was fine." He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back harder than necessary, unable to look at her directly. "You can clear it." "Yes, sir." He left the room without another word, and Clara stood there a moment, looking at the empty plate, completely clean, not a scrap left. No complaint given, but none needed, and something in her chest eased slightly, the tightness of a woman who had walked 3 miles in brutal heat, not knowing if she'd have a roof over her head by nightfall. She didn't know yet what that meal had done to the man who'd eaten it. She only knew he'd finished every bite, and for a woman who had nowhere else to go, that felt like enough of a beginning. Nathan stood in the hallway outside the dining room for a long moment after he left, one hand pressed flat against the wall, breathing slow and careful, like a man steadying himself after a blow he hadn't seen coming. He hadn't cried since the funeral. He didn't cry now. But something in his chest had cracked wide open at the taste of that stew, some door he'd kept bolted shut for 6 years. And he stood there in the dark hallway, fighting the strange, unwelcome, terrifying sensation of feeling something again. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay awake a long time, listening to unfamiliar sounds moving through the house, footsteps overhead. Water running, the soft creak of a door 2 rooms down, where a stranger was settling into a bed that had sat empty since before he could remember. It should have bothered him having someone else's presence fill the silence he'd built his whole life around protecting. It didn't. That bothered him more than anything. The following morning, Nathan came down to find 2 cups sitting on the breakfast table instead of 1, and he stopped in the doorway staring at them for a long moment before Clara noticed him standing there. "I apologize," she said quickly, reaching to take the extra cup away. "Habit, I suppose. I didn't think—" "Leave it," Nathan said more roughly than he intended. Clara paused, cup halfway, lifted, studying his face with the same steady patience she'd shown at the gate the day before. "You sure?" He wasn't sure of anything. He hadn't been sure of anything in 6 years, but something about the second cup sitting there catching the morning light felt less like an intrusion, and more like a small, fragile piece of something he'd thought was gone forever. "I said leave it," he repeated, and sat down at the table across from the empty second chair, and for the first time in 6 years, poured himself coffee into a cup that wasn't the only one on the table. Clara didn't say anything else. She simply nodded, went back to the stove, and let the silence between them settle into something that felt for the first time in a long while less like isolation and more like the quiet comfort of 2 people learning how to share a space. Over the following days, small things began to shift around Cole Ranch that nobody spoke of directly, but everybody noticed. The kitchen smelled like fresh bread every morning. The herbs Clara had planted beside the window began to sprout green against the dry Montana dust. The dining table, which had collected 6 years of quiet neglect, had its dust wiped clean and its wood polished until it caught the lamplight in the evenings. Eli Parker was the first of the ranch hands to properly meet her wandering into the kitchen on his 3rd day looking for water and finding instead a plate of biscuits set aside specifically for him. "These for me?" he asked, disbelieving. "You're the one who works cattle from sunup, aren't you? A growing man needs more than what Cook Riley used to leave out before he moved on." Clara didn't look up from her work. "Eat them before they go cold." Eli ate one right there, standing in the kitchen doorway, and something about the simple kindness of it being fed, being noticed, being spoken to, like he mattered, put a look on his face that Tom Baker, passing by outside, caught through the window and smiled at, without quite knowing why. "She's good for this place," Tom said to Nathan later that week, the 2 of them checking fence line together in the cooling evening air. "She's a cook, Tom. She's more than a cook, and you know it. First week she's here, the boys stopped flinching every time somebody raises their voice near him. First week she's here, and you're eating full plates instead of pushing food around like you're doing it out of obligation." Nathan didn't answer right away, focused on the fence post in front of him instead of the truth Tom was circling. "Don't read into things that ain't there." "I ain't reading into nothing. I'm just saying what I'm seeing." Tom's voice gentled the way it did when he was trying to reach the part of Nathan that had gone quiet 6 years ago and never fully come back. "Elizabeth's been gone a long while, Nathan. Ain't nothing wrong with a house feeling like a home again." "Don't," Nathan said, sharp enough that Tom held up both hands and let the subject drop, but the words stayed with Nathan the rest of the evening, needling at him while he sat alone in his study long after the house had gone quiet, staring at nothing, thinking about a woman with steady eyes and a mended dress who had walked 3 miles into his life and started without seeming to try to take it apart piece by careful piece. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she was simply a good cook doing good work, and that the second cup on the table meant nothing, and that the sound of her humming in the kitchen in the mornings meant nothing, and that the way his chest had eased slightly every day that week meant absolutely nothing at all. He was lying to himself, and some stubborn, honest part of him knew it even as he tried. Word of the new cook at Cole Ranch reached town within the first 2 weeks, the way word of anything involving Nathan Cole always did. Sarah Higgins mentioned it to a customer at the general store, who mentioned it to her sister, who mentioned it at church. And by the time the story had made its full circuit through the gossiping women of the county, it had transformed from a simple hiring into something far more scandalous. A widow all alone out there with him. Mrs. Colleen Ford said to her circle of friends outside the church one Sunday, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. No family to speak for her, no connections at all. You have to wonder what a woman like that is really after. Perhaps she's simply hungry and needs work, offered one of the quieter women in the group, but her comment was waved away without much consideration. Plenty of decent women need work, and don't go walking 3 miles alone to a rich widower's ranch to find it. Mrs. Ford's mouth pursed with satisfaction at her own cleverness. Mark my words, that woman knows exactly what she's doing. Poor Nathan Cole, grieving all these years, an easy target for a woman with nothing left to lose. The rumor spread fast. After that, the way rumors always spread faster than truth, in small towns, hungry for something new to talk about. By the time it reached Clara's ears, carried unfortunately by a delivery boy, who repeated it without thinking right there in the ranch kitchen, thinking he was simply making conversation, the story had grown teeth. Folks in town are saying you came out here looking to trap Mr. Cole into marrying you, the boy said, entirely too young to understand the weight of what he was repeating. Saying you're after his money on account of you got nothing else. Clara went very still at the stove, her back to the boy, and it took her a long moment to trust her voice enough to answer. Is that what they're saying? Yes, ma'am. My ma said it just yesterday. Well? Clara turned around, and if the boy noticed anything wrong with her expression, he was too young and too oblivious to comment on it. You tell your ma I said thank you kindly for her concern, and that I'll be right here cooking Mr. Cole's supper, regardless of what she thinks I'm after. The boy left with his delivery satisfied, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen a long moment after he'd gone, hands braced against the counter, breathing slow and controlled. The way she'd learned to breathe through hard things since her husband's death, since the winter that took everything, since she'd first understood that the world was often crueler to a poor widow than it had any right to be. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself a long time ago that she wouldn't waste tears on people who'd never bothered to know her before deciding what she was. But that night, alone in her small room above the kitchen, with the house finally quiet, and the ranch settled into darkness outside her window, the careful composure she'd held together all day finally began to crack. She thought of her husband gone less than a year, and the cruel efficiency with which the fever had taken him. She thought of the farm they'd built together, sold piece by piece, just to survive the winter after his death. She thought of walking 3 miles in brutal heat, with nothing but a broken suitcase and a fragile hope that somewhere, somehow, her work might be enough to earn her a place in the world again. And she thought of a town full of women who had decided without a single conversation exactly what kind of woman she must be. She pressed a hand over her mouth to keep the sound from carrying, and let herself cry quiet and controlled the careful tears of a woman who had learned not to let grief take up more space than it was given. She didn't know that Nathan Cole was awake too that night, standing in the dark hallway outside his own bedroom, his hand resting against the wall near the narrow staircase that led up to the small room above the kitchen. He'd come out for water and stopped instead at the bottom of those stairs, some instinct pulling his attention upward the moment he heard the faint, muffled sound of someone crying quietly enough that they clearly didn't want to be heard. He stood there a long time, torn between two versions of the man he'd become over the past 6 years. The one who kept every door in his life locked, every emotion buried, every connection severed before it could grow deep enough to hurt him again. And some older, quieter version of himself, the man he'd been before. Grief hollowed him out, who couldn't stand the sound of someone suffering alone in his own house without doing something about it. He climbed the stairs before he'd fully decided to. He stopped outside her door, hand raised to knock, and hesitated a long moment, listening to the sound of her trying to steady her own breathing on the other side of the thin wood. He thought of every reason to walk back down those stairs and let her grieve in private, the way he himself had grieved in private for 6 long years. He thought of Elizabeth's locked room down the hall, the one nobody was allowed to enter, the one that held 6 years of a grief he'd never once let anyone help him carry. He knocked anyway. The crying stopped immediately. A long silence followed, the particular silence of someone hurriedly wiping their face and steadying their voice before answering. "Yes, Miss Whitmore." Nathan's own voice came out rougher than he meant it to, uncertain in a way he wasn't used to being. "You all right in there?" Another pause. "I'm fine, Mr. Cole. Just tired is all." He knew a lie when he heard one. He'd told enough of them himself over the years, to Tom, to the ranch hands, to anyone who asked how he was really doing since Elizabeth died, always some version of, "I'm fine," covering something that was very much not fine at all. "I heard about what's being said in town," he said before he could talk himself out of it. "About you." Silence longer this time. When Clara spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful control. "I didn't ask you to defend me, Mr. Cole. I don't need anyone fighting my battles. I ain't fighting anything. I'm standing outside your door at midnight because I heard you crying, and I couldn't rightly walk past it." He pressed his palm flat against the doorframe, uncertain what to do with his own hands, his own voice, his own unfamiliar impulse to comfort another human being after 6 years of avoiding exactly that. Those people talking don't know the first thing about you, don't know what you walked through to get here, don't know a damn thing except that they'd rather tear a stranger down than admit their own lives are dull enough to need the gossip. The door opened slower than he expected, and Clara stood there in the low lamplight, her eyes red-rimmed, but her composure largely reassembled, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "Why do you care what they say about me?" she asked quietly. Nathan opened his mouth to answer with something simple, something safe. "Because it isn't right. Because you work hard. Because you don't deserve it." But what came out instead surprised them both. "Because you're the first person who's walked into this house in 6 years and made it feel like something other than a place I'm waiting to die in." He said low and rough, the words dragged up from somewhere he'd kept sealed shut since the funeral. "And I'll be damned if I let a bunch of gossiping women in town decide what that's worth." Clara stared at him. Something shifting behind her eyes, some wall she'd been holding up all day, finally beginning to lower. "That's the most you've said to me since I got here," she said softly. "Don't get used to it." But there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, something that hadn't been in Nathan Cole's voice in longer than either of them could rightly measure. And for a long moment, they simply stood there in the narrow hallway. A grieving rancher and a grieving widow. Two people who had both learned to carry their pain alone, standing close enough now that the loneliness didn't feel quite as absolute as it had that morning. "Get some rest, Miss Whitmore," Nathan finally said, stepping back toward the stairs. "Ranch needs its cook sharp in the morning." "Yes, Mr. Cole." He was halfway down the stairs when her voice stopped him. "Nathan?" He turned. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something in the sound of it, spoken soft in the dark hallway, landed somewhere deep in his chest. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not walking past it." Nathan Cole, who hadn't let himself need anyone or be needed by anyone in 6 long years, gave a short nod and continued down the stairs without trusting himself to say anything else, because some part of him, the part he'd kept locked away as carefully as that shut room down the hall, was beginning to understand that this quiet, steady, stubborn widow might be the first crack in a wall he'd spent 6 years convinced could never come down. He didn't sleep that night either. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, the sleeplessness didn't feel like grief keeping him awake. It felt unfamiliar and unwelcome and impossible to ignore, like the first stirring of something that might, given time, look a great deal like hope. Morning came slow over Cole Ranch, gray light easing through Nathan's window before he'd even decided whether he'd slept at all. He lay there a long moment, listening to the house the way he always did. Except this morning, the sounds coming up through the floorboards were different than they'd been in 6 years. The clatter of a skillet water pouring, someone humming low under her breath in a kitchen that used to sit as silent as a held breath. He came downstairs to find 2 cups on the table again, same as every morning that week. And this time, he didn't stare at the second one like it was a stranger sitting in his house. He just poured his coffee and sat down. Clara set a plate in front of him without a word, but there was something careful in the way she did it. Something watchful, like she was checking whether last night's hallway conversation had changed the shape of things between them, or whether he'd wake up regretting every word he'd said in that dim upstairs corridor. "You sleep all right?" Nathan asked gruff, not looking up from his plate. "Well enough." Didn't sound like it. Clara's hand stilled at the stove for half a second before she went back to what she was doing. "I appreciate you asking, Mr. Cole. I'm fine." "Nathan," he corrected before he could think better of it. "You said it last night. Don't see a reason to go back to Mr. Cole in the daylight." She turned, then studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between surprise and something warmer. "All right, Nathan." The way she said it settled into him strange, a small thing that shouldn't have mattered, and mattered more than he wanted to admit. He finished his breakfast faster than usual and got up from the table before the quiet between them could turn into something he didn't know how to handle yet. But even as he walked out to the barn that morning, something in his chest sat lighter than it had in longer than he could rightly remember, and he caught himself halfway across the yard, actually looking forward to supper. He hated how much that scared him. Tom noticed it too. Tom noticed everything, which was half the reason Nathan kept him around all these years, despite the man's habit of saying things nobody asked him to say. "You're whistling," Tom said, falling into step beside him near the corral. "I ain't whistling." "You were. First time in 6 years I heard you whistle anything that wasn't a cattle call." Tom's mouth twitched, fighting a grin he knew better than to let loose fully. "Must have been a good breakfast." "Don't start. I ain't startin' nothin'. Just making an observation, same as any man's entitled to." Tom leaned against the fence rail, watching Nathan check a bridle he didn't need to check. "She's good for you, Nathan, whether you want to hear it or not. I heard you the first time you said it. Then maybe hear it a second time on account of you didn't seem to believe it." Tom's voice gentled, dropping the teasing edge. "I watched you bury that woman 6 years back and turn into somebody I barely recognized. Watched you shut every door in this house and in yourself right along with it. I ain't saying forget Elizabeth. I ain't saying replace her. I'm saying maybe it's all right to let somebody else in without it being some kind of betrayal." Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Tom thought he'd pushed too far the way he sometimes did, forgetting that grief didn't take kindly to being managed by other people's opinions of how long it should last. "You don't know what it is," Nathan said, finally low. "No," Tom agreed. "I don't. But I know what 6 years of watching you eat alone in that big empty room looked like, and I know what 1 week of a decent woman's cooking has done to the way you're standing this morning. That's all I know, and that's all I'm gonna say about it." He walked off toward the barn before Nathan could argue further, and Nathan stood there a long moment in the cool morning air, turning Tom's words over the same way he'd turned over Clara's voice, saying his name in the dark hallway the night before. He didn't have an answer for either one yet, but something had shifted, quiet and undeniable, and pretending otherwise was getting harder by the day. That afternoon, Nathan hitched the wagon and told Clara she'd best come along into town since the pantry needed restocking, and there wasn't any sense sending Tom when she'd know better what the kitchen actually required. It was, he told himself, purely practical. He didn't examine too closely why he found himself checking twice that she had a proper bonnet against the sun, or why he slowed the wagon on the rougher patches of road without being asked. Town greeted them the way town always greeted anything new to talk about, with sideways looks and lowered voices that weren't nearly as quiet as the speakers believed. Clara felt it the moment they pulled up outside the general store. Women who'd been chatting on the boardwalk went abruptly silent, eyes cutting toward her, and then away, the particular silence of people who'd clearly been discussing you moments before you arrived to interrupt it. She kept her chin level and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, because she'd learned a long time ago that showing weakness to a crowd already looking for reasons to judge you only fed the fire. "Well," came a voice from the boardwalk, pitched just loud enough to carry across the street. If it isn't Mr. Cole's new cook. Clara turned to find Mrs. Colleen Ford standing with two other women, all three of them wearing expressions of polite interest that didn't quite disguise the hunger underneath. "Mrs. Ford," Clara said evenly. "Afternoon. I do hope you're settling in all right out at that big ranch. Must be quite an adjustment going from nothing at all to a house that grand." Mrs. Ford's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Quite a stroke of fortune for a woman in your position." "I earn my wages same as anybody, ma'am. There's no fortune in it beyond honest work." "Of course." Mrs. Ford exchanged a glance with the women beside her, the kind of glance that said everything her words didn't. "Though I imagine a widow with nothing left might find certain arrangements rather convenient. A rich man, all alone, no family watching close. Must be tempting, wouldn't you say, to make yourself indispensable to a man like that?" Nathan came around the wagon before Clara could answer, and something in his face had gone hard as flint. "You got something to say to me, Colleen, you say it to my face," he said, his voice carrying flat and cold across the street. "Don't hide behind talking at my cook like she ain't standing right there with ears that work fine." The boardwalk went quiet. Even the women beside Mrs. Ford seemed to shrink back slightly, unused to seeing Nathan Cole speak more than 3 words together in town, let alone with that particular edge in his voice. "Nathan, I only meant, I know exactly what you meant." Nathan stepped up onto the boardwalk close enough now that Mrs. Ford had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You've been trying to marry me off to your niece for 2 years running, and now that a woman's come along who actually does honest work in my house instead of angling for my bank account, you can't stand it. That about the size of it." Mrs. Ford's face flushed deep red. "I never—" Clara Whitmore walked 3 miles in the middle of a heat wave to ask for honest work, and in 2 weeks she's done more for that ranch and every soul living on it than half this town's managed in years of gossiping on this boardwalk. You want to talk about who's really after something, Colleen? I'd start looking a little closer to home." He turned before she could respond, offering Clara his arm with a gesture that was more protective than courteous, and walked her straight past the stunned silence and into the general store without a backward glance. Inside, away from the street, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yeah," Nathan said, still tight with anger. "I did. They're only going to talk more now. Let them talk." He picked up a crate of supplies with more force than necessary, setting it on the counter. "I spent 6 years letting this town whisper about me being some grieving hermit who couldn't hold himself together enough to leave his own house. I stopped caring what they think a long time ago. Ain't about to start caring now, especially not when it's you they're trying to tear down instead of me." Something in his voice, rough and fierce and entirely unguarded, landed somewhere deep in Clara's chest, and she found herself looking at him with an expression she quickly tried to smooth away before he noticed. He noticed anyway. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She busied herself with the shopping list, cheeks warm. "It's just nobody's defended me like that in a long while, Nathan. Not since my husband." The mention of her husband hung between them a moment, and Nathan felt something complicated move through him, not jealousy exactly, but something adjacent to it. Some recognition that she'd loved and lost, same as he had, that they were both walking around carrying the same kind of weight, even if they carried it differently. "He sounds like he was a good man," Nathan said carefully. "He was." Clara's voice softened. "Not perfect, but good, steady. He worked himself half to death trying to keep that farm going right up until the fever took him." She paused and something flickered across her face, quick and painful. "I used to think I'd never feel anything but numb again after that. Just get up, do what needs doing, and not let myself feel much of anything, because feeling things hurt too much to bear. I know that feeling. I imagine you do." She looked at him steady, something understanding passing between them that needed no further words. "It's strange. I feel more today standing on that boardwalk with you shouting at Colleen Ford than I've felt in almost a year." Nathan didn't know what to say to that. He busied himself with the supplies instead, but the words stayed with him the rest of the afternoon, turning over slow in his mind, like something precious. He wasn't quite ready to hold up to the light and examine directly. They were nearly done loading the wagon when a stranger's voice cut smooth and confident across the street. "Nathan Cole, is it?" Nathan turned to find a well-dressed man approaching tailored suit, entirely out of place among the dust and homespun cotton of the town, a gold watch chain glinting at his vest, and a smile that reminded Nathan uncomfortably of a man selling something nobody actually needed. "Depends who's asking." "Marcus Holloway." The man extended a hand which Nathan shook briefly without warmth. "I've been hoping to make your acquaintance. I've heard a great deal about Cole Ranch. Fine piece of land from what the surveys tell me." "What surveys?" "Just some general territory assessments." Marcus's smile widened easy and untroubled, the smile of a man used to getting exactly what he came for. "I represent certain investment interests looking to expand operations in this region. Your land in particular has caught our attention. I'd very much like the opportunity to discuss a proposal with you at your convenience." Nathan's instincts, the same ones that had kept his ranch profitable and his cattle protected for years, prickled with immediate unease. "My ranch ain't for sale." "Everything has a price, Mr. Cole." Marcus said it lightly, almost pleasantly, but there was something underneath it that Nathan didn't care for at all, something cold and calculating that no amount of expensive tailoring could disguise. "I'd hate for you to dismiss an opportunity before you've even heard the numbers. I've heard enough." Nathan turned back to loading the wagon, dismissing the man with his back the way he might dismiss a fly buzzing too close to his food. Marcus's smile flickered just slightly, something harder passing beneath the surface before the pleasant mask slid back into place. "Well, I'll be in the territory a while longer. Perhaps you'll reconsider." His eyes moved to Clara standing quiet beside the wagon, and something in his gaze lingered a beat too long, appraising, calculating. "And who might this be?" "My cook," Nathan said flatly, stepping slightly between them without seeming to notice he'd done it. "None of your concern." "Of course." Marcus tipped his hat, but his eyes stayed on Clara a moment longer than was polite. "Ma'am." Clara said nothing, but something cold moved through her at the way the man had looked at her, calculating in a way that had nothing to do with attraction, and everything to do with the particular hunger of a man assessing every possible weakness he could exploit. Marcus walked off down the boardwalk unhurried, and Nathan watched him go with a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there a moment before. "You know that man?" Clara asked. "Never seen him before in my life." Nathan climbed up onto the wagon seat, offering her a hand up beside him. "Don't like him." "Neither do I." They rode back to the ranch mostly in silence, both of them turning over the strange encounter, though neither yet understood how deep the danger that man represented would eventually reach into the life they were only just beginning to build. The days that followed settled into something that felt, despite everything, almost peaceful. Clara's presence continued reshaping the ranch in small, steady ways, herbs thriving green against the kitchen window, the smell of fresh bread greeting the hands each morning, laughter creeping back into a house that had forgotten the sound of it. Eli Parker in particular seemed to bloom under Clara's quiet attention. She made a habit of setting aside extra portions for him, noticing the way the older hands sometimes mocked him for his nervousness, his tendency to apologize for things that weren't his fault. "You don't have to say sorry for existing, you know," she told him one afternoon, catching him apologizing for the third time in 10 minutes over a dropped bucket. "Sorry," Eli said automatically, then caught himself flushing red. "I mean, sorry for saying sorry." Clara laughed, warm and genuine, the sound of it carrying out the open kitchen window into the yard where Nathan happened to be passing, and something in his chest eased at the sound of it, unfamiliar and welcome all at once. "Where'd that come from, all that apologizing?" Clara asked gently. Eli hesitated, scuffing his boot against the floor. "My pa used to say I couldn't do nothing right. Guess it stuck." "Well, your pa ain't here, and I'm telling you different." Clara handed him a biscuit, still warm. "You work harder than half the men on this ranch, and Mr. Cole thinks well enough of you to keep you on. That ought to count for something." Eli's face did something complicated. Gratitude and disbelief tangled together, and he mumbled a thank you before hurrying back out to his chores. But something in his posture had straightened just slightly, the way it had the day Nathan told him he wasn't useless. It was a small thing, but small things, Clara was learning, added up to something larger than the sum of their parts, and the ranch itself seemed to be healing in ways nobody had quite named out loud yet. Not everyone welcomed the change, though. Rafe Dunlop, the oldest and roughest of the ranch hands, had worked for Nathan nearly as long as Tom had, and he didn't much care for the shifting atmosphere Clara had brought with her. "Boy's getting soft," Rafe muttered one evening, loud enough for Eli to hear across the bunkhouse. "Cook's been babying him like he's still nursing at his mama's teat." "Leave him be, Rafe," Tom warned. "I'm just saying what everybody's thinking. This ranch used to run on hard work, not on some widow's biscuits and sweet talk." Rafe's eyes cut toward Eli, deliberately cruel. "Boy needs to toughen up, not get coddled." Eli's face went red humiliation plain, and he opened his mouth to apologize on reflex before catching himself. Clara's words from earlier still fresh enough to hold him steady. "I don't need toughening up from a man who's spent 30 years complaining about work he's too lazy to do himself," Eli said, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. The bunkhouse went dead silent. Rafe's face darkened dangerously, and for a moment it looked like the confrontation might turn physical, until Tom stepped between them, with the easy authority of a man who'd broken up more bunkhouse fights than he could count. "That's enough, both of you. Rafe, you got a problem with how things are run around here. You take it up with Mr. Cole directly, instead of picking on a boy half your age." Tom's voice left no room for argument. "Eli, go on and get some air." Eli left, shaking slightly, but with his shoulders held straighter than Tom had ever seen them, and Rafe muttered something under his breath about that widow stirring up trouble before stalking off to his bunk. Tom didn't mention the incident to Nathan directly, figuring it would blow over the way most bunkhouse squabbles did. He was wrong. 3 days later, Nathan found Eli in the barn, well past dark, sitting alone with his knees drawn up, clearly upset about something he wasn't inclined to discuss. "What happened?" Nathan said, not really a question. "Nothing, Mr. Cole." "Don't lie to me, boy. I ain't in the mood." Nathan sat down on an overturned crate across from him, patient, despite the gruffness in his voice. "Rafe giving you trouble?" Eli's silence answered well enough. "He's been at it a few days now. Says I'm getting soft. Says Clara's been babying me." Eli's voice cracked slightly. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I am soft." "You ain't soft." Nathan's voice roughened with an intensity that surprised them both. "You're decent. That ain't the same thing, and any man who tells you different is measuring toughness by the wrong yardstick." Eli looked up, startled by the conviction in Nathan's voice. "I was a boy same as you once." Nathan continued, quieter now. "Poor. Nobody thought I'd amount to much of anything, including my own father some days. Took me a long while to understand that being decent to people ain't weakness. It's the hardest thing a man can be, most days harder than any fence work or cattle drive." He stood, offering Eli a hand up. "Rafe gives you more trouble, you come to me directly. I don't tolerate that kind of talk on my ranch. Never have." "Yes, sir." Eli took his hand, standing straighter than he had in days. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. Nathan's fine out here where nobody's listening." Something passed between them, quiet and steadying, and as they walked back toward the bunkhouse together, Nathan found himself thinking, not for the first time that week, about how much of himself he'd buried alongside Elizabeth, and how much of it seemed to be quietly resurrecting itself, since a stubborn widow had walked 3 miles up his road with nothing but a broken suitcase and more grit than half the men he employed. The next real turning point came without warning, the way trouble usually did. It started as an ordinary afternoon, Clara working in the garden behind the kitchen, pulling weeds from around the herbs she'd planted, humming to herself in the warm sun, until she heard the panicked shouting from the direction of the barn. Fire in the hay barn. Clara dropped what she was doing and ran, her heart slamming against her ribs, arriving just in time to see thick black smoke pouring from the barn's loft where the hay stores were kept. Ranch hands scrambled with buckets from the well, but the flames had already caught faster than the water could contain them, licking hungrily up the dry timber walls. "Where's Eli?" someone shouted. "He was up in the loft not 10 minutes ago." Clara's blood ran cold. "He's still in there." Nathan came sprinting from the house, having heard the commotion, taking in the scene in an instant. The flames, the smoke, the panic on every face except his own, which had gone hard and focused in the particular way of a man who didn't have time for fear. "Tom, get the buckets going on the west wall. Keep it from spreading to the stock pens." His voice cut clean through the chaos, commanding absolute. "Rafe, get the horses out now." He was already moving toward the barn door before he'd finished giving orders, ignoring Tom's shout of warning, disappearing into the smoke without a moment's hesitation. "Nathan!" Clara's voice tore out of her raw with fear, but he was already gone, swallowed by black smoke and orange light. The next several minutes stretched into an eternity. Clara stood frozen at the barn door, every instinct screaming at her to run in after him, held back only by Tom's firm hand on her arm and his low, urgent voice telling her to stay back, stay clear, let the men work. "He's got Eli!" someone shouted from inside. "They're coming out." Nathan emerged from the smoke a moment later, one arm wrapped tight around Eli's shaking shoulders, half carrying the boy who'd been overcome by smoke before he could find his way to the ladder. Nathan's shirt was scorched at one shoulder, his face blackened with soot, but he was upright, moving alive. Clara reached them before anyone else, her hands shaking as she helped ease Eli down to the ground, checking him over with the frantic efficiency of someone who'd nursed sickness and injury through harder winters than this. "He's breathing," she said, relief cracking through her voice. "He's breathing. He's all right." Eli coughed hard, smoke blackened and terrified, but very much alive, and Clara held his hand tight until his breathing steadied, murmuring reassurance the whole while. It was only once Eli was settled, once the fire had been beaten back enough that it wouldn't spread further, that Clara turned her attention fully to Nathan, and the sight of him soot-streaked singed his hands, shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade, undid something in her she hadn't expected. "You could have died," she said, her voice breaking. "You ran in there without a second thought. Couldn't leave the boy," Nathan said simply, like it was the only possible answer, like there had never been another option worth considering. "That doesn't mean you get to risk your own life for—" Her voice caught, and she pressed a hand over her mouth, fighting back tears that had nothing to do with smoke. "Clara." Nathan's voice gentled, and he reached for her hand, before he'd fully decided to his soot-blackened fingers, wrapping careful around hers. "I'm all right. Look at me. I'm all right." She looked at him, really looked, taking in every detail. The singed shirt, the soot on his face, the exhaustion and adrenaline still burning bright in his eyes, and something in her chest cracked open entirely, some final wall she'd been holding up since her husband's death, finally giving way. "I can't lose someone else," she whispered, barely audible. "I can't do that again." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them had expected, revealing more than either had planned to reveal so soon. Nathan went very still, understanding exactly what she'd just admitted, what those words meant, coming from a woman who guarded her heart as fiercely as he guarded his. "You ain't gonna lose me," he said, low and rough, his hand tightening around hers. "Not like this, not over some hay barn." Around them, the ranch hands were still working to fully douse the last of the flames, Tom directing efforts with practiced calm, but in the small space between Nathan and Clara, the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, hands clasped together, something unspoken and enormous passing between them in the smoke-thick air. Neither of them moved to close the distance further. Neither of them needed to, not yet. But something had shifted permanently in that moment, something neither of them could take back or pretend away, and they both knew it, even as they stepped back from each other and returned to the urgent business of tending the fire's aftermath. Later that night, once the barn fire had been fully extinguished and the damage assessed bad, but not catastrophic, a portion of the hay stores lost, but the structure itself salvageable, Nathan found himself sitting on the porch steps long after the household had gone quiet, staring out at the scorched section of barn wall visible in the moonlight. Clara found him there sometime past midnight, unable to sleep herself. Carrying 2 cups of coffee, she hadn't quite decided whether she'd actually offer him or simply use as an excuse to check on him one more time. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, settling onto the step beside him without waiting for an invitation. "Keep thinking about how close that was." Nathan accepted the coffee she handed him, his voice quieter than usual. "Boy's 19 years old. Whole life ahead of him. Came damn close to losing that today over a stack of hay." "You saved him." "Barely." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Few more minutes in that smoke and it might have gone different." Clara studied his profile in the moonlight, the soot still faintly visible at his hairline, despite his attempt to wash it clean, the tension still coiled tight in his shoulders. "You didn't hesitate, not even for a second. You just ran straight in. Didn't think about it, just did it. That's the kind of man you are, Nathan, whether you see it in yourself or not." Clara's voice softened. "You keep telling everyone you're just a hard, closed-off rancher who doesn't need anybody and doesn't feel much of anything anymore. But I've watched you this past month. I've watched you defend me on that boardwalk, encourage Eli when nobody else would run into a burning barn without a second thought for your own safety. That ain't a closed-off man. That's a man who feels everything deep as anyone I've ever known and has just spent 6 years pretending otherwise because it hurt too much to feel it out loud." Nathan didn't answer right away, staring out at the dark yard, something working behind his expression that he clearly wasn't ready to name. "Elizabeth used to say something similar," he said, finally quiet. "Said I loved harder than I let on account of I was scared of what it'd cost me if I lost it." "She sounds like she knew you well." "She did." Nathan's voice roughened. "That's part of why it broke me so bad when she went. Wasn't just losing a wife, was losing the one person who understood me better than I understood myself." He looked over at Clara, then something raw and unguarded in his expression that she'd never seen from him before. "I locked that door upstairs the week after the funeral. Everything of hers still in there exactly where she left it. Couldn't bring myself to go through it. Couldn't bring myself to let anyone else near it either." Clara's chest tightened at the admission, understanding. Now the full weight of that locked room, the significance he'd never fully explained the day she arrived. "You don't have to tell me this," she said gently. "I know I don't." He looked down at the coffee in his hands, turning the cup slowly. "Want to, though. First time in 6 years I've wanted to talk about her out loud instead of just carrying it around silent." "Then talk," Clara said simply. "I'm listening." And so under the wide Montana sky, with the smell of smoke still faint on the night air and the scorched barn, a dark silhouette against the stars, Nathan Cole began haltingly at first, and then with growing steadiness, to talk about his wife for the first time in 6 long years. Her laugh, her stubbornness, the particular way she used to burn the biscuits every single time, no matter how many years she practiced the 4 brutal days of fever that had taken her before he'd even fully understood what was happening. Clara listened without interrupting, without offering hollow comfort, simply present in the way that mattered most, and somewhere in the telling of it, something in Nathan that had been clenched tight for 6 years finally slowly began to loosen its grip. "I ain't ready to unlock that room," he said finally, once the words had run their course. "Not yet. Maybe not for a good while still. But I think for the first time since she died, I might actually get there someday. And I don't think that would have happened if you hadn't walked up my road with that broken suitcase." Clara reached over and took his hand again, the same way she had earlier that day in the smoke and chaos outside the barn. Except this time, there was no urgency to it. No fear, just quiet, steady comfort passing between 2 people who understood exactly what the other had survived. "Grief doesn't disappear," she said softly. "I don't think it's supposed to. But I think it can make room eventually for something else to grow alongside it, if you let it." They sat there a long while in comfortable silence, hands linked watching the stars wheel slow overhead, and neither of them spoke of what was clearly growing between them, because some things they both seemed to understand without saying. It needed time and care before they could be named out loud. But the closeness between them didn't go unnoticed, and not everyone watching was pleased by what they saw. 3 days after the fire, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Nathan, delivered by a messenger who refused to say who'd sent it. Nathan opened it in his study, expecting business correspondence, and found instead something far uglier, an anonymous accusation claiming Clara Whitmore had left her previous position under scandalous circumstances, that she'd been dismissed for stealing from a former employer, that her husband's death had been less an accident of fever, and more the result of neglect on her part. None of it, as Nathan would soon discover, was true. But the venom in the letter's careful, deliberate handwriting suggested someone had gone to considerable trouble to manufacture lies specific enough to sound plausible, cruel enough to do lasting damage if believed. Nathan sat with the letter a long while, his hands shaking with an anger he hadn't felt in years, before he folded it carefully and rode straight into town, jaw set, determined to find out exactly who had written it and why. He didn't yet know that the letter's origins traced back to a well-dressed stranger with a gold watch chain and a smile like a closing trap. A man who'd realized after their brief encounter outside the general store that the fastest way to break Nathan Cole's resolve about his land wasn't through business negotiations at all. It was through destroying the one thing that had finally brought light back into Nathan Cole's carefully guarded life. And Marcus Holloway, watching from the window of his rented room above the town saloon, smiled as he watched Nathan Cole ride past, in a fury, already turning over the next move in a plan that had only just begun. Nathan rode into town with the letter folded hard in his fist, and by the time he reached the sheriff's office, his knuckles had gone white around the reins. Sheriff Wade Collins looked up from his desk, taking one look at Nathan's face, and set down his coffee without being asked. "Something wrong, Nathan?" "Somebody sent me this." Nathan slapped the letter down on the desk. "Full of lies about my cook. Says she stole from a former employer. Says her husband's death weren't no accident of fever. Says she let him die neglected. Every word of it's poison, and I aim to find out who wrote it." Wade unfolded the letter, reading slow, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. "No signature." "Course there ain't. Coward wouldn't put his name to something this ugly." "You got any idea who'd want to hurt Miss Whitmore bad enough to write something like this?" Nathan's jaw worked, and he thought of Marcus Holloway's easy smile outside the general store, the way his eyes had lingered on Clara a beat too long. "Maybe." "You got proof?" "Not yet." Nathan's hand curled into a fist on the desk. "But I intend to get some." He rode straight from the sheriff's office to Sarah Higgins' store, where he found her behind the counter, same as always, and asked her plain whether she'd seen anybody unusual asking questions about Clara. "Now that you mention it," Sarah said slowly, "there was a well-dressed fellow in here last week asking all sorts of questions. Wanted to know where your cook came from, what her situation was, whether she had any family looking out for her. Struck me as odd at the time, but I figured he was just being neighborly. Gold watch chain, fancy suit." "That's the one." Nathan's blood went cold with certainty. Marcus Holloway hadn't come to Montana just to buy land. He'd come to destroy whatever stood between him and getting it, and he'd found the softest, most devastating target available, a grieving widow with no family to defend her, and a reputation easy enough to poison with a few well-placed lies. Nathan rode back to the ranch with that certainty burning in his chest, and he found Clara in the garden kneeling among her herbs, her hands still and her face pale in a way that told him she'd already heard something. Clara. She looked up, and the careful composure she wore around everyone else had cracked just slightly, revealing the hurt underneath. "The Turner boy came by with the mail. Said folks in town are saying I stole from my last employer, saying I let my husband die of neglect." Her voice shook on the last words. "That's a lie, Nathan. A cruel, wicked lie. I nursed him myself every single day of that fever, until there weren't anything left of me to give, and he died anyway. I would never—" "I know." Nathan crossed the garden fast, crouching down in front of her, his hands finding hers. "I know it's a lie, Clara. I know exactly who's behind it, too." "Who?" "Marcus Holloway. That land investor from the general store. Sarah says he's been in town asking questions about you, digging for anything he could twist into a weapon." Nathan's voice hardened. He wants my ranch, and he's figured out the fastest way to break me is to hurt you." Clara's eyes widened, understanding dawning slow and terrible. "Because of the letter. Because he thinks if he destroys my reputation, you'll be so consumed with protecting me that I'll cave on selling just to make it stop." "Yeah." Nathan's grip tightened on her hands. "He's wrong. I ain't caving on nothing, and I sure as hell ain't letting him destroy you to get what he wants." But even as he said it, Nathan felt the cold weight of what they were facing settle over him. Marcus Holloway wasn't a man who gave up after one failed attempt. If a single letter could shake them this badly, there was no telling what he'd try next. He didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 nights later, Tom woke Nathan before dawn, his voice tight with urgency through the bedroom door. "Nathan, you need to see this." Nathan dressed fast and followed Tom out to the north pasture, where he found half a mile of fence line torn down, posts snapped clean, wire cut in a dozen places. 20 head of cattle had wandered loose in the dark, scattered across open range, where wolves and rustlers alike could pick them off at leisure. "This ain't weather damage," Tom said grimly, crouching to examine one of the cut wires. "Somebody did this deliberate. Clean cuts, every one of them." Nathan stood in the gray pre-dawn light, staring at the destruction, and felt the same cold certainty settle over him that had gripped him after the letter. "Holloway. Can't prove it. Don't need to prove it to know it." Nathan's voice was flat dangerous. "Get every hand out here rounding up what cattle we can find. I want this fence rebuilt by sundown, and I want somebody keeping watch on this pasture every night going forward." The hands worked through the day, exhausted and furious, chasing down scattered cattle across rough terrain, rebuilding fence line, under a brutal sun, and by the time evening fell, every man on the ranch understood without being told that Cole Ranch was under attack, even if nobody could yet prove who was pulling the strings. Rafe Dunlop, for all his earlier grumbling about Clara, found himself unexpectedly vocal on the matter that evening in the bunkhouse. "Don't care what any of you think about the Cook situation. Somebody's trying to ruin this ranch, and that's a fight I signed up for the day I took this job. I say we find out who's responsible and make them regret it." "Can't go making accusations without proof," Tom warned. "That's how good men end up in worse trouble than they started with." "Then we get proof," Rafe said. And for the first time since Clara's arrival, he found himself in complete agreement with the rest of the hands about something. Clara heard about the fence sabotage from Eli, who came to the kitchen that evening looking shaken and angry in equal measure. 20 head loose overnight, all on account of somebody wanting to hurt Mr. Cole, Eli said, accepting the plate Clara set in front of him without his usual enthusiasm. "This is because of that landman, ain't it? Because Mr. Cole won't sell." "I believe so, yes. That ain't right. Man ought to be able to keep what's his without somebody trying to burn it down around him." Eli's jaw tightened, an expression Clara hadn't seen on him before, something steadier and angrier than the nervous boy who'd first apologized for dropping a bucket. "I'll keep watch tonight if Mr. Cole wants, whatever it takes to protect this place." Clara felt a swell of something protective and proud watching the boy who'd once flinched at raised voices, now volunteering to stand guard against a threat he barely understood. And she thought not for the first time about how much this ranch had changed in the short weeks since she'd walked through its gate. She found Nathan on the porch that night, staring out at the dark pasture where the sabotage had happened, his shoulders tight with a tension that hadn't eased since morning. "You should eat something," she said gently, setting a plate beside him. "You skipped supper." "Not hungry." "Nathan." She sat down beside him, her voice firm but kind. "Starving yourself won't fix that fence, and it won't stop Marcus Holloway. You need your strength for whatever comes next." He looked at her, something raw and exhausted in his expression. "This is my fault, Clara." "How is any of this your fault? If I'd just sold him the land when he first asked, none of this would be happening. The fence would still be standing. Nobody would have written you that letter." Nathan's voice roughened. "I'm so damn stubborn about holding on to something my father built that I'm letting it put you in danger." "Stop that!" Clara's voice sharpened, surprising them both. "You listen to me, Nathan Cole. This ranch is your father's legacy. It's your home. It's the home you're rebuilding piece by piece into something that finally feels alive again after 6 years of silence. You don't owe Marcus Holloway a single inch of it, and you sure don't owe him the satisfaction of watching you cave to threats and sabotage. He's not going to stop Clara. Men like that never stop until they get what they came for. Then we don't stop either. Clara took his hand, her grip fierce despite her calm voice. I didn't survive burying my husband and losing everything I owned just to run scared from some wealthy bully in a fancy suit. And I don't believe for 1 second that you're the kind of man who runs scared either. Not the man who ran into a burning barn without a second thought. Not the man who stood up to an entire boardwalk full of gossiping women just to defend my honor. Something in Nathan's chest eased at her words, the fierce conviction in her voice steadying him in a way he hadn't expected. You really believe that we can fight this and win? I believe we don't have any other choice worth considering. Clara's expression softened. And I believe you're not fighting it alone anymore, whether you like it or not. Nathan looked at her a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and before either of them fully understood what was happening, he leaned in and pressed a soft, uncertain kiss to her temple. Not her lips, not yet, but something tender and searching. All the same, a question neither of them was quite ready to answer aloud. Clara went still surprised, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him slightly, resting her head against his shoulder, and they sat there together in the dark, watching over the ranch that both of them had, without quite meaning to come to think of, as something worth protecting with everything they had. The fragile peace didn't last. 2 days later, Nathan received word that his contract with the cattle buyer in Helena had mysteriously fallen through a deal he'd relied on for years, suddenly canceled with no clear explanation beyond a curt letter citing changed circumstances. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, especially once Nathan learned through a friendly contact in Helena that Marcus Holloway had visited the buyer's office personally just days before the cancellation. He's squeezing you, Tom said grimly when Nathan told him the news. Cutting off your income one deal at a time. Man's got money enough to make life miserable for you until you got no choice but to sell. Then we find other buyers. Nathan, half the buyers in this territory do business with men like Holloway. He's got connections we don't have. This ain't a fight you can win with grit alone. Nathan's frustration boiled over, sharp and sudden, in a way it hadn't in years. So what, I just roll over, hand him the land my father built with his bare hands because some wealthy stranger decided he wanted it? I ain't saying roll over, I'm saying we need help. Real help. Other ranchers who might be facing the same kind of pressure. The idea took root slow, but by the following week, Nathan found himself riding out to visit the Hendricks place, a smaller spread bordering his own. To the east, after hearing secondhand that old man Hendricks had been having troubles of his own. Fences cut a barn fire that started under suspicious circumstances, a sudden and unexplained difficulty securing loans from the bank he'd used for 20 years. Same man's been sniffing around your land too? Nathan asked, sitting across from Hendricks at his kitchen table. Fancy fellow gold watch chain? Yeah. Came by about 2 months back offering to buy me out. I told him no, same as I imagine you did. Been nothing but trouble since. Hendricks's weathered face was grim. Lost half my herd to a mystery illness that started right after a stranger was seen near my water supply. Bank called in a loan I'd been paying steady for years, no warning at all. Feels like the whole world's turned against me overnight. You think it's him? I know it's him. Can't prove it in a court of law, but I know it same as I know my own name. Hendricks leaned forward, something urgent in his weathered eyes. You ain't the only one he's after, Nathan. There's at least 3 other ranches in this territory getting squeezed the same way. Man's after something bigger than just your land or mine. Whole stretch of territory, best I can figure, all sitting on whatever those surveys found underground. The revelation hit Nathan like a physical blow. This wasn't just his fight. It never had been. Marcus Holloway had been quietly dismantling an entire community, one ranch at a time, using the same cruel tactics of sabotage, financial pressure, and manufactured scandal, counting on each family to face him alone and afraid, too proud or too isolated to realize they were facing a coordinated attack. We need to talk to the others, Nathan said something clarifying in his chest. All of us. Together. Hendricks studied him a long moment, something like relief passing across his weathered features. Took you long enough to come around to that thought, son. Was starting to think you'd fight this whole thing alone out of pure Cole family stubbornness. Wouldn't be the first time. Nathan admitted a faint, exhausted smile touching his mouth. But I got somebody now who won't let me get away with that anymore. Word spread fast. Once Nathan and Hendricks began quietly reaching out to the other affected ranchers, the Millers, the Cassidys. Old widow Thornton, whose small spread had been under similar pressure for months without her fully understanding why. Within a week, 5 ranching families had agreed to meet secretly at the Cole Ranch, away from town and away from anyone who might report back to Holloway about what they were planning. Clara worked through the night before the meeting, preparing enough food to feed a small army, refusing Nathan's suggestion that she hire extra help from town. I don't trust anybody from town right now, she said, kneading bread dough with more force than strictly necessary. Not after that letter. Not after everything Colleen Ford's been saying. Better I do it myself and know exactly who's in this kitchen. You don't have to do all this alone, Clara. I'm not alone. She looked up at him, flour dusting her cheek, something warm passing between them, despite the tension of the coming days. I've got you. And Tom. And Eli, bless him, though he's more enthusiasm than skill in a kitchen. A small, genuine laugh escaped her, the first real laughter either of them had managed in days. Just let me do this my way, Nathan. Feeding people who are scared and angry and don't know where else to turn, that's something I understand how to do. The meeting itself, held in Nathan's long dining room, around a table that hadn't seated more than 2 people in 6 years, was tense from the first moment ranchers began filing in, wary and exhausted, each carrying their own version of the same story. He offered me twice what the land's worth, said Ellen Cassidy, a sharp-eyed widow who ran her late husband's spread with an iron will. Then when I refused, my well water turned foul within the week. Cost me half my cattle before I figured out somebody'd poisoned it deliberate. Bank called in my loan without warning, said young Robert Miller, barely 30, and clearly overwhelmed by the pressure bearing down on his family's spread. 20 years my pa did business there, never missed a payment, and suddenly they want the whole balance in 30 days, or they take the land. Same story, different details, Hendricks said grimly. Man's playing a long game, breaking us one at a time, so nobody notices the pattern until it's too late. So what do we do about it? Ellen demanded, looking around the table with sharp, assessing eyes. None of us can prove anything in a court of law. Man's careful, covers his tracks well. Nathan stood at the head of the table, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and found himself for the first time in 6 years, stepping fully into the role his father had once held. Not just a rancher protecting his own land, but a leader capable of rallying a scattered, frightened community into something stronger together than any of them could manage alone. We start documenting everything, he said, his voice steady with a conviction that surprised even himself. Every incident, every date, every detail. Alone, each of our stories sounds like bad luck. Together, it's a pattern too clear for any judge to ignore. We pool what we know, we find out exactly who's behind those falsified surveys claiming resources on this land, and we take him to court before he destroys every last one of us. That takes money we don't have, Robert Miller said, defeated. Man like Holloway's got lawyers on retainer. We got nothing but cattle and dirt. Then we find a way, Nathan said. I got resources most of you don't. I'll cover legal costs where I can. But I need every one of you to trust me enough to work together instead of facing him alone, because alone, he's already proven he can pick us apart one at a time. Silence settled over the table, heavy with the weight of pride and fear, both until Clara, who'd been standing quietly near the kitchen doorway, listening to the entire exchange, stepped forward with something in her hands. I kept books for my husband's farm for 6 years, she said, all eyes turning toward her. I understand how to track numbers, how to spot patterns in financial records that don't add up right. If you're willing to share what documentation you have, bank records, land assessments, anything at all, I can help organize it into something clear enough to present in court. Ellen Cassidy studied Clara a long moment, sharp eyes assessing. You're the cook everybody in town's been gossiping about. I am. Heard some ugly things said about you. Most of it lies spread by the very man we're trying to stop, Clara said evenly, meeting Ellen's gaze without flinching. I understand if that makes you hesitant to trust me, but I'd rather spend my energy proving my worth through what I can actually do to help than arguing against rumors that were never true to begin with. Something shifted in Ellen's expression, a grudging respect creeping into her sharp features. Well, can't say I don't admire a woman who doesn't waste time on self-pity. She pushed a folder of documents across the table toward Clara. Here's everything I've got on my situation. Let's see what you can make of it. Over the following days, Clara worked late into every night, poring over financial records and land documents brought by each affected family, cross-referencing dates and figures with a diligence that surprised even Nathan, who found himself bringing her coffee at midnight more often than not, watching her work by lamplight, with an admiration that had grown into something far deeper than simple respect. You're remarkable, you know, he said one such night, setting a cup beside her elbow. Clara looked up exhausted, but focused a faint smile touching her mouth. I'm tired mostly. That too. He sat down across from her, watching her work a moment longer. But remarkable all the same. I don't know a single other person who could take a stack of confusing bank records and turn it into something a judge could actually understand. My husband used to say I had a mind for numbers wasted on farm bookkeeping. Something bittersweet crossed her expression. I think he'd be glad to know it's finally being put to use for something this important. Nathan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. I think he'd be glad to know you found somewhere you belong again too. Clara's eyes lifted to his, something vulnerable and hopeful passing between them. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the lamplight, surrounded by papers that represented both an enormous threat and, slowly, a path toward defeating it. It was well past midnight when Clara finally found the discrepancy that changed everything. A series of falsified land survey documents, each one bearing the same forged signature from a geological surveyor who, upon further investigation the next morning, turned out not to exist at all. Look at this, she said, practically vibrating with excitement as she spread the documents across the table for Nathan and Tom to examine. Every single survey claiming valuable resources beneath these ranches was supposedly conducted by the same surveyor, a man named Jasper Reed. I wrote to the Territorial Geological Survey Office in Helena 2 days ago asking for his credentials. And, Nathan asked, no such surveyor exists, never has. Marcus Holloway invented an entire identity-forged, legitimate-looking survey documents and used them to convince banks, investors, and half this county that our land was worth stealing. Clara's voice trembled with barely contained triumph. It's fraud, Nathan. Provable, documented fraud. If we can get this in front of a judge, we can end him. Tom finished, grinning wide for the first time in weeks. Nathan, this is it. This is exactly what we needed. Nathan stared at the documents, something fierce and hopeful rising in his chest for the first time since the sabotage began. Get everyone back here tomorrow. We need to move on this fast before he realizes we're onto him. But word unfortunately traveled both directions, and Marcus Holloway had eyes and ears throughout the county that none of them had fully accounted for. The very next evening, as the ranchers gathered again at Cole Ranch to review Clara's findings and plan their legal strategy, a rider came thundering up the road at a dangerous pace, and Eli burst into the dining room, breathless and pale. Mr. Cole, there's men at the north pasture, and they ain't ours. Nathan was on his feet instantly, every rancher in the room rising with him, the meeting dissolving into urgent motion. How many? 6, maybe 7. Armed. Rafe sent me to warn you before they... The sound of gunfire cracked through the night air, distant but unmistakable, and the entire room went cold with the same terrible understanding. Marcus Holloway had stopped playing games. Nathan grabbed his rifle from beside the door, already moving. Tom, get every hand armed and out to that pasture now. Robert Hendricks, you're with me. Ellen, get the women and children into the house and bar the doors. Nathan! Clara caught his arm, fear plain on her face. Be careful, please. He paused just long enough to press a fierce, urgent kiss to her forehead. Stay inside. Whatever happens, stay inside and keep everyone safe." Then he was gone, thundering out into the dark with Tom and the others, rifles ready, racing toward whatever violence Marcus Holloway had unleashed against them. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him disappear into the darkness, her heart hammering with a fear she hadn't felt since the night the doctor told her there was nothing more to be done for her husband, and she found herself praying fierce and desperate that she wouldn't lose someone else to a fight that had never been fair to begin with. The night stretched on endless and terrifying gunfire, echoing distant across the dark pasture, while Clara and Ellen worked to keep the frightened women and children calm inside the ranch house, every one of them straining to hear news of what was happening beyond the walls. It was nearly 2 hours before Tom came riding back hard, and the look on his face as he burst through the door sent ice through Clara's veins. "Nathan's hit," he said, breathless and grim. "Shoulder wound. He's alive, but we need the doctor fast." Clara's world narrowed down to a single point of terror. "Where is he?" "Bringing him in now. Wound ain't fatal, but it's bad enough." She was out the door before Tom finished speaking, running across the dark yard toward the approaching riders, and the sight of Nathan slumped in his saddle blood, soaking dark through his shirt, nearly buckled her knees beneath her. "Nathan, I'm all right," he managed, though his voice was tight with pain as Tom and Hendricks helped him down from the horse. "Just a scratch." "That is not a scratch, that is a bullet wound, and you will let me look at it right now." Clara's fear transformed instantly into fierce, focused determination. The same steady competence she'd carried through her husband's illness now turned toward keeping this man alive. "Get him inside, now!" They laid Nathan out on the dining table that had weeks ago sat untouched and gathering dust, and Clara worked with practiced hands to clean and dress the wound while they waited for the doctor to arrive from town, her fingers steady despite the terror still hammering through her chest. "We drove them off," Tom reported, standing anxious nearby. "Whoever they weren't expecting real resistance, ran once we started shooting back." "Anybody see faces?" Hendricks asked. "Anything that ties them back to Holloway?" "Nothing conclusive, but there's no doubt in my mind who sent them." Tom's jaw was tight with fury. "Man's escalating fast. Sabotage and letters weren't working fast enough, so now he's sending armed men." Nathan, pale and gritting his teeth against the pain of Clara's careful ministrations, managed a grim, determined smile. "Then he's just handed us exactly what we need. Armed assault on a peaceful ranch, witnessed by half a dozen respectable ranchers. That's a crime a judge can't ignore, fraud documents or not." "Assuming you live long enough to testify to it," Clara said sharply, though her hands remained gentle as she finished binding the wound. "Which you will, because I did not survive burying one husband just to bury the second man I've come to care about over a bullet wound that's going to heal just fine, if you'll stop talking and let your body rest." The room went quiet at her words, the accidental admission hanging heavy in the air, "the second man I've come to care about." And Clara's face flushed deep red as she realized what she'd said in front of a room full of witnesses. Nathan, despite the pain, despite the blood loss, despite the exhaustion of the entire terrible night, found himself smiling anyway. Something warm cutting through the pain. "Say that again when I ain't bleeding all over my own dining table, and I might just believe you mean it." "I mean it, regardless of the blood, Nathan Cole." Clara's voice was fierce, unashamed now that the words were already out. "I mean it more than I've meant anything in a very long while." Around them, the gathered ranchers exchanged knowing glances, some small measure of warmth breaking through the tension of the terrible night, and even Ellen Cassidy, sharp and unsentimental, as she was allowed herself a small approving smile at the exchange. The doctor arrived within the hour, confirming what Clara's field treatment had already accomplished. The wound was serious, but not life-threatening. The bullet having passed clean through without hitting bone, and with proper rest, Nathan would recover fully within a few weeks. But the assault had changed something fundamental in the fight against Marcus Holloway. What had begun as sabotage and manufactured scandal had crossed now into open violence, and every rancher gathered in that room understood the stakes had risen to something far more dangerous than any of them had initially anticipated. "We can't wait any longer to move on the fraud evidence," Hendricks said grimly once the doctor had finished, and Nathan had been settled, still pale but stable, into a proper bed. Man's already tried to burn one man's ranch, poison another's water, and now he's sending armed men to attack a peaceful gathering. Next time somebody might not survive it. Agreed. Clara's voice was steady despite the exhaustion evident in her face. I'll have the complete documentation ready within 2 days. Every falsified survey, every suspicious financial pattern cross-referenced and organized clearly enough for any judge to understand exactly what Marcus Holloway has been doing to this community. And the attack tonight? Ellen asked. 6 witnesses, Nathan wounded, clear evidence of armed assault against innocent ranchers. That alone might be enough to bring the law down on him properly, fraud aside. Then we use everything we've got, Nathan said from the bed, his voice weak but determined, refusing to be left out of the planning despite his injury. The fraud, the sabotage, tonight's attack, all of it presented together, undeniable. We take this to the territorial judge in Helena, not the local circuit court, where Holloway's money might buy him influence. We do this right, and we do it fast, before he has time to cover his tracks any further. Clara sat beside his bed, long after the others had gone to their own beds. For what remained of the night, her hand wrapped careful around his, watching him drift in and out of exhausted, pain-medicated sleep. "You scared me tonight," she whispered once she was certain he was fully asleep and couldn't hear the vulnerability in her voice. "More than I've been scared in a long, long while." Nathan's eyes opened slightly more awake than she'd realized. "Sorry for that. Don't apologize. Just—" Her voice caught, and she pressed his hand gently to her cheek, needing the contact, needing the reassurance that he was still here, still warm, still alive, despite everything Marcus Holloway had thrown at him. "Just don't leave me, Nathan. I don't think I could survive that kind of loss again. Ain't planning on going anywhere," he murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion and medication, but his hand tightened around hers with as much strength as he could manage. "Not now. Not when I finally got something worth staying alive for." Clara stayed beside him the rest of the night, watching over him the way she'd once watched over her husband in his final illness. Except this time, mercifully, dawn brought recovery instead of loss. And by morning, Nathan's fever had broken his color, returning his strength, slowly beginning to knit itself back together alongside the wound in his shoulder. But even as Nathan recovered, the danger surrounding them had only intensified. And 2 days later, as Clara finished organizing the last of the fraud documentation into a clear, damning case against Marcus Holloway, a new threat arrived that neither of them had fully anticipated. A formal notice delivered by the county sheriff himself informed Nathan Cole that Marcus Holloway had filed a countersuit accusing Nathan of assault of illegally organizing armed resistance against legitimate business interests, and most devastatingly accusing Clara Whitmore directly of fraud, claiming she had fabricated the very documents she'd spent weeks carefully compiling, painting her instead as a con artist who had manipulated a grieving widower into a scheme to defraud legitimate investors. Clara read the accusation with growing horror, her hands trembling around the paper. "He's twisting everything, making it look like I'm the criminal, like I planned this from the very beginning to trap you into believing lies. It's desperate," Nathan said, sitting up in bed despite the doctor's orders for continued rest, fury burning through the last of his exhaustion. "He's scared, Clara. Wouldn't be filing counter-accusations this wild if he weren't scared we've actually got enough evidence to bring him down. Scared people are dangerous people," Clara said quietly, staring at the document that threatened to unravel everything they'd built. "If this goes to court, and a judge believes even a fraction of what he's claiming, I could face real charges. Prison Nathan. Over lies he's fabricated to save himself." Nathan reached for her hand, his grip fierce despite his weakened state. "That is not going to happen. I will not let that happen. You can't control what a judge decides." "No, but I can make damn sure that judge sees the truth so clear there's no room left for his lies to take hold." Nathan's jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had built Cole Ranch from nothing, the same fierce protectiveness that had sent him running into a burning barn without a second thought. "We go to Helena. All of us. Every rancher, every piece of evidence, every witness to what happened here. We end this once and for all, Clara, and I promise you, I am not going to let that man destroy you the way he's tried to destroy everything else in this territory." Clara looked at him. This man who'd been nothing but a stranger with sad eyes and a cracked dinner plate just weeks before now, fighting with everything he had to protect her from a danger neither of them had asked for. And she felt something settle deep in her chest. Not just gratitude, not just growing affection, but something that felt terrifyingly and wonderfully like the beginning of real love. "All right?" she said, finally steadying her voice with effort. "Then let's go to Helena and end this." Outside, the Montana sky had darkened with the promise of an approaching storm. Thunder rolling low and distant across the plains, and neither of them could yet know whether they were riding toward salvation or ruin. Only that whatever waited for them in that territorial courthouse would determine not just the fate of Cole Ranch, but the fragile, precious thing that had begun growing between them in the wreckage of both their broken hearts. The road to Helena took 3 days, and Nathan rode every mile of it with his shoulders still bound tight beneath his shirt, refusing every suggestion that he stay behind and let the others carry the fight without him. "You ain't fully healed," Clara said again, riding close beside the wagon that carried their documentation, watching him with the particular worry of a woman who'd already lost one man to circumstances beyond her control. "I ain't missing this," Nathan said, same as he'd said the first 2 times she'd raised it. "This is my ranch, my father's legacy, and it's your name Holloway's trying to drag through the mud. I'll be there when that judge hears the truth, wound or no wound." Clara didn't argue further, understanding by now that some battles with Nathan Cole weren't worth fighting, but she kept her horse close to his the whole ride anyway, watching for any sign of fatigue or fever that might signal the wound reopening. Behind them came a procession, unlike anything the territory had seen in years. Tom driving the supply wagon, Hendricks and Robert Miller riding alongside Ellen Cassidy, sharp-eyed and grim in her own saddle, and Eli bringing up the rear with a rifle across his lap, young face set with a seriousness that had replaced his old nervous apologies entirely. "Never thought I'd see the day," Tom remarked, riding beside Nathan on the second afternoon, 5 ranching families banding together against a common enemy. "Your father would have been proud of this, Nathan. Proud of what you built here, and prouder still of what you're fighting for now." Nathan didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the weight of everything resting heavy on his shoulders. Wouldn't have gotten here without Clara. Wouldn't have thought to reach out to the others, wouldn't have understood we were all facing the same enemy alone. She's the one who saw the pattern in all Holloway's lies. "Then it's a good thing she walked up your road that day," Tom said simply. "Best thing that's happened to this ranch in 6 long years." They reached Helena on the evening of the 3rd day, exhausted and travel-worn, and found the town far larger and more intimidating than any of them had anticipated. Proper brick buildings, a courthouse with white columns that seemed to Clara like something from a picture book rather than real life, and streets crowded with strangers who eyed their dusty, road-weary group with open curiosity. Marcus Holloway, they soon discovered, had arrived a full day ahead of them and had spent that day well. "He's been buying drinks for half the local businessmen," Hendricks reported grimly, returning from a scouting trip through town's saloons. "Talking us up as a mob of desperate ranchers trying to steal legitimate business opportunity through violence and slander. Man's got half the town believing he's the victim here. Then we make sure the judge hears different," Nathan said, though the news settled heavy in his chest. Money bought influence, and Marcus Holloway had more of it than all of them combined. Clara spent that night in their rented rooms, reviewing every document one final time, her hands steady despite the exhaustion of 3 days' hard travel, determined that nothing would be left to chance when they finally stood before the judge. "You should rest," Nathan said, finding her still awake well past midnight, papers spread across the small table. "Can't. Not until I'm certain every piece of this fits together clean enough that no lawyer, however expensive, can pick it apart." She looked up at him, exhaustion and determination both plain in her face. "This isn't just about clearing my name anymore, Nathan. It's about every family who trusted us enough to bring their evidence, their stories, their livelihoods into this fight. I won't let them down." Nathan crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently in his. "You haven't let anybody down, Clara. Not once, not from the very first day you walked through my gate. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already proven exactly who you are to everyone who matters. And if the judge believes his lies anyway, if money buys the verdict the way it's bought, half this town's opinion. Then we keep fighting, however long it takes." His voice roughened. "But I don't believe that's how this ends, Clara. I've watched you take a stack of confusing bank records and turn them into undeniable truth. I've watched you win over Ellen Cassidy, who don't trust anybody easy, and encourage a scared boy into a confident young man, and organize 5 frightened families into something strong enough to stand together. That kind of truth doesn't lose to a man who's built his whole life on lies." Clara leaned into him, drawing strength from his certainty, even as her own wavered, and they sat together a long while in the lamplight, neither speaking, simply present in the quiet before the storm that tomorrow would bring. The courthouse the next morning was packed tighter than Clara had expected, word of the dramatic territorial dispute having spread through Helena's business community with the speed of any good scandal. Marcus Holloway sat at the front of the room in an immaculate new suit, flanked by 2 expensive-looking lawyers, his easy, confident smile firmly in place as though he'd already won before the proceedings even began. Judge Elias Whitfield, a stern, silver-haired man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, called the court to order, and the countersuit proceedings began with Holloway's lawyer painting an elaborate picture of a scheming widow and a grief-addled rancher conspiring to defraud legitimate business interests through fabricated documents and coordinated harassment. Clara sat rigid beside Nathan, her hands clenched tight in her lap, listening to herself described as calculating, manipulative, a woman who'd preyed on a lonely man's grief for personal gain, and it took every ounce of her composure not to stand and shout the truth into that crowded room. "Easy," Nathan murmured, his hand finding hers beneath the table, steady, despite his own simmering fury at hearing her character assassinated so thoroughly in a room full of strangers. "Our turn's coming." Their turn came sooner than expected, when Nathan's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Margaret Cole, no relation but happy to take the case once she'd reviewed their evidence, one of a small but growing number of women beginning to practice law in the territory, rose to present their case with a confidence that immediately shifted the room's attention. "Your Honor, my clients aren't here to discuss theories or accusations," Margaret said clearly. "We're here to present documented, verifiable fraud alongside eyewitness testimony to armed assault against peaceful citizens. I'd like to begin by calling Mrs. Clara Whitmore to present the financial documentation she compiled." Clara rose on legs that felt unsteady. But the moment she reached the witness stand and began laying out the evidence, the falsified surveys, the non-existent surveyor, Jasper Reed, the precise pattern of financial pressure applied simultaneously to 5 different ranching families. Her voice steadied her nervousness, burning away beneath the clarity of undeniable fact. "Every single survey claiming valuable resources beneath these 5 ranches bears the signature of a man named Jasper Reed," she said, holding up the documentation for the judge and jury to examine. "I wrote directly to the Territorial Geological Survey Office in Helena, requesting his credentials and license number. Here is their response dated 11 days ago, confirming that no surveyor by that name has ever been licensed in this territory." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Marcus Holloway's confident smile flickered just slightly for the first time since proceedings began. "Furthermore," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with every word, "I've documented the precise timing of financial pressure applied to each affected family. Canceled loans, mysteriously failed cattle contracts, poisoned water sources, and sabotaged fencing, all occurring within days of each family refusing to sell their land to Mr. Holloway's investment interests. The pattern is too precise, too coordinated to be anything but deliberate." Holloway's lawyer rose sharply. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation dressed up as documentation. My client cannot be held responsible for every unfortunate coincidence affecting ranchers who refused a legitimate business offer." "Overruled," Judge Whitfield said, his sharp eyes fixed on Clara with growing interest. "The witness may continue. I find her documentation considerably more compelling than coincidence, Counselor." Clara continued, methodical and precise, walking the courtroom through every piece of fraud she'd uncovered, and by the time she stepped down from the witness stand, the confident murmur that had greeted Holloway's opening arguments had transformed into something far more skeptical, far more suspicious of the well-dressed stranger who'd arrived in their territory with nothing but lies and forged documents. But the true turning point came when Nathan took the stand himself, his shoulder still bandaged beneath his shirt, and described in plain, unflinching detail the night armed men had attacked his ranch during a peaceful gathering of concerned ranchers. 6 men armed coming onto my land in the dark while I hosted a meeting of neighboring ranchers all facing the same coordinated harassment. Nathan said, his voice carrying clear and steady through the silent courtroom. I took a bullet defending my home and the people gathered there. 5 other witnesses can confirm every detail of that attack, Your Honor, and I'd be more than willing to have this court examine my wound directly if there's any doubt about the truth of what happened. Holloway's lawyer attempted to suggest the attack had been staged, a desperate fabrication to support their fraud accusations. But the suggestion crumbled entirely when Sheriff Wade Collins took the stand next, confirming he'd personally examined the scene the following morning and found clear evidence of an armed confrontation, spent shell casings, trampled ground blood that matched Nathan's account precisely. By the time Ellen Cassidy Hendricks and Robert Miller had each testified to their own individual experiences of sabotage and financial pressure, all following the identical pattern Clara had documented. The courtroom's sympathy had shifted entirely away from the wealthy stranger in his expensive suit and firmly toward the coalition of ordinary ranchers fighting to protect their land and their community. Marcus Holloway's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the proceedings, finally began to crack during cross-examination when Margaret Cole pressed him directly on the non-existent surveyor whose forged signature appeared on every fraudulent document. Mr. Holloway, can you produce Jasper Reed? Can you have him appear before this court to verify his credentials and confirm the accuracy of these surveys? He's difficult to locate at present, Holloway said, his easy smile finally faltering. Surveyors travel extensively for their work. Or perhaps, Margaret said, letting the words hang deliberately in the silent courtroom. He's difficult to locate because he doesn't exist, and you invented him specifically to fabricate false evidence of mineral resources that were never actually found on these ranchers' land. That's a baseless accusation. Is it? Then perhaps you can explain why the Territorial Survey Office has no record of him. Perhaps you can explain why every single instance of sabotage and financial pressure documented by these witnesses happened within days of your personal visits to their respective ranches. Perhaps you can explain why armed men attacked Mr. Cole's property during a meeting specifically organized to expose your fraud. Holloway said nothing. His jaw tight, and in that silence, the entire courtroom understood with growing certainty exactly who had orchestrated the elaborate scheme to steal territory across 5 separate ranches through fear, fabrication, and violence. Judge Whitfield called for a brief recess before delivering his verdict, and Clara sat beside Nathan in the crowded hallway outside the courtroom. Both of them exhausted from the intensity of the proceedings, hands clasped tight together as they waited to learn whether their fight had been enough. Whatever happens in there, Nathan said quietly. I want you to know something, Clara. These past weeks with you fighting alongside you, watching you stand up in that courtroom with more courage than most men I've known, that's been the best thing to happen to me since I lost Elizabeth. Win or lose today, I don't regret a single moment of it. Clara's eyes filled emotion, breaking through the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the difficult proceedings. I feel the same way, Nathan. Whatever happens walking up that road to your ranch was the best decision I've made since my husband died. You gave me somewhere to belong again, someone to fight for something worth building even in the middle of all this danger. Their moment was interrupted by the bailiff calling them back into the courtroom, and they rose together, hands still clasped, to hear the verdict that would determine not just the fate of 5 ranching families, but the future of everything they'd begun building together in the wreckage of their shared grief. Judge Whitfield's expression as he took his seat and surveyed the crowded courtroom offered no immediate clues to his decision, and the silence stretched taut and unbearable as everyone waited for him to speak. In all my years on this bench, he began finally, I have rarely encountered fraud as elaborate and cruel as what's been presented before this court today. Mr. Holloway, you have systematically targeted vulnerable ranching families, fabricated false evidence to justify predatory land acquisition, and when legitimate business tactics failed to achieve your goals, you escalated to sabotage, character assassination, and ultimately, armed violence against innocent citizens. Holloway's face had gone pale, his lawyers exchanging uneasy glances as the judge's tone made clear which direction this verdict was heading. This court finds overwhelming evidence supporting the fraud allegations brought against you, and further finds credible, well-documented evidence connecting you directly to the sabotage and armed assault described by multiple witnesses. Your countersuit against Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Cole is dismissed entirely as baseless and retaliatory. A collective breath released through the courtroom, relief and vindication rippling through the gathered ranchers. But Judge Whitfield wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the severity and coordinated nature of these crimes, I am referring this matter to territorial prosecutors for criminal charges including fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to assault. Mr. Holloway, you will remain in this territory's custody pending further investigation, and I strongly suspect your business interests here have concluded rather more permanently than you anticipated when you arrived. The courtroom erupted into stunned, joyful chaos, ranchers embracing each other in relief and vindication after weeks of fear and uncertainty. And Clara found herself pulled into Nathan's arms, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously as the weight of everything they'd fought for finally gloriously lifted from their shoulders. "We did it," Clara said, disbelief and joy tangled together in her voice. "Nathan, we actually did it." "You did it," Nathan corrected, pulling back just enough to look at her properly, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered trying to hide. "Your documentation, your courage on that witness stand, your refusal to run scared even when everything seemed stacked against us. This victory belongs to you as much as anyone." Around them, the other ranchers celebrated their own hard-won vindication. Hendricks pumping Robert Miller's hand enthusiastically. Ellen Cassidy allowing herself an actual smile as she embraced Tom in relieved gratitude. Eli practically vibrating with excitement as he recounted the courtroom drama to anyone who'd listen. But for Nathan and Clara, standing together in the chaos of celebration, the moment belonged entirely to each other. Two people who'd walked into this fight carrying separate griefs, separate losses, and had emerged from it having found something neither had expected to find again. "Clara." Nathan's voice turned serious quiet beneath the surrounding celebration, his hands finding hers with a gentle certainty that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I mean every word of it." "Nathan, I spent 6 years telling myself I was done feeling anything beyond grief. Told myself the man who loved Elizabeth died right alongside her, that whatever was left of me wasn't capable of caring about anyone or anything ever again." His voice rough and raw with honesty. "Then you walked up my road with a broken suitcase and more stubborn determination than anyone I'd ever met. And every single thing I told myself about being done, feeling turned out to be a lie." Clara's eyes filled her hands, trembling slightly in his. "Nathan, let me finish, please." He drew a steadying breath. "I love you, Clara, not the way I loved Elizabeth, because that kind of love was its own thing, belonging to its own time in my life. But something just as real, just as deep, born out of watching you feed a scared boy back into confidence, watching you stand up to a courtroom full of strangers, with more courage than most men I know, watching you choose to stay and fight for a home and a family that wasn't even yours yet, when you could have run at the first sign of danger and nobody would have blamed you." Tears spilled freely down Clara's face. Now joy and love and relief all tangled together after weeks of fear and uncertainty. "I love you too, Nathan Cole. I think I've loved you since that first night you climbed those stairs and knocked on my door instead of walking past my grief the way most people would have. I love the man who runs into burning barns without thinking twice, who defends strangers on boardwalks against gossiping crowds, who spent 6 years grieving so deeply because he loved so completely, and who somehow still had enough heart left over to let me in." Nathan kissed her, then right there in the crowded courthouse hallway, surrounded by celebrating ranchers and stunned onlookers. A kiss that held 6 years of grief finally beginning to heal alongside the promise of everything still waiting to be built between them. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Tom's voice carried loud and delighted from somewhere nearby. "Well, it's about damn time. The gathered ranchers erupted into cheers and laughter, and Clara buried her flushed face against Nathan's shoulder, overwhelmed by joy, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember, while Nathan held her close. His heart lighter than it had been in 6 long years. Finally fully ready to build a future he'd once believed was lost to him forever. The ride back from Helena felt nothing like the ride out. 3 days earlier, the wagon had rolled north carrying fear exhaustion and evidence that might not have been enough. Now it rolled home carrying 5 vindicated families, a healing wound, and something between Nathan and Clara that no longer needed to hide itself behind careful words and cautious distance. "You're staring," Clara said, catching Nathan's eyes on her for the 3rd time in an hour. "I'm allowed to stare at my own intended," Nathan said, testing the word out loud for the first time, watching her face for reaction. Clara's breath caught. "Your intended. Unless you got objections." "No." A slow smile broke across her face, the kind that reached all the way to her tired eyes. "No objections at all, Nathan Cole." Tom, riding just close enough to hear, let out a whoop loud enough to startle his horse. Finally said it out loud. Took the man 6 years to grieve and 3 weeks to fall in love. But Lord, did he take his sweet time announcing it. "Watch your mouth, Tom." "Wouldn't dream of it, boss. Just happy for you both." Tom tipped his hat toward Clara, genuine warmth in his weathered face. "Ranch is gonna be a different place with you running that kitchen permanent, Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Cole soon enough," Clara said, testing the name the same way Nathan had tested his word, and something about hearing it out loud, out in the open Montana air, with the whole company listening, made it feel suddenly wonderfully real. The homecoming, when they finally reached Cole Ranch 2 days later, was unlike anything the property had seen in longer than anyone could remember. Word had traveled ahead of them somehow the way news always did in ranching country, and a small crowd had gathered at the gate to welcome them home. Ranch hands, a few neighboring families, even Sarah Higgins from the general store, who'd ridden out personally once she heard how the trial had ended. "Never seen this town come together like this," Eli said, grinning wide as he helped unload the wagon. "Feels different somehow, like everybody finally remembered we're supposed to look out for each other instead of tearing each other down." "That's what happens when the truth wins," Clara said, watching the gathered crowd with something like wonder. People remember what decency looks like. But even amid the celebration, Nathan noticed the way Colleen Ford hung back near the edge of the crowd, uncertain of her welcome, and something in him softer now than it had been in years, more forgiving than the man who'd shouted her down on that boardwalk weeks earlier, pulled him toward her instead of away. "Mrs. Ford." Colleen's chin lifted, bracing for whatever sharp words she assumed were coming. "Mr. Cole." "Come to gloat, or come to apologize." Her composure cracked, slightly genuine shame flickering across her face. "I was wrong about Miss Whitmore. Wrong to spread those rumors, wrong to assume the worst about a woman I'd never bothered to actually know." She glanced past him toward Clara, who stood watching the exchange with cautious attention. "I owe her an apology I don't imagine she's obligated to accept." Nathan studied her a long moment, remembering his own 6 years of locked doors and buried grief, understanding better than most how fear and loneliness could curdle into cruelty if given enough time to fester. "Everybody's capable of being wrong, Colleen. Questions whether you're capable of doing better going forward." "I intend to try." "Then that's a start worth something." He stepped aside, letting her approach Clara, and watched from a respectful distance as the 2 women spoke quietly. Colleen's apology visibly awkward but sincere. Clara's response gracious in a way that spoke to a generosity of spirit. Nathan had come to love more with every passing day. The wedding, when it finally came, arrived not with grand plans or elaborate preparations, but with the simple, unhurried certainty of 2 people who no longer needed anything except each other to make the moment complete. They married in early spring, in the same dining room where Clara had once served her first hesitant meal to a grieving stranger, where Nathan had bled from a bullet wound while declaring his growing feelings in front of a room full of witnesses, where months of fear and healing and slow, steady love had unfolded one supper at a time. The room looked nothing like the silent, dust-covered space Clara had first encountered. Fresh flowers from her garden filled every corner. The long table, once a monument to loneliness, now groaned under the weight of a celebration feast prepared by Clara herself, refusing any suggestion that someone else handle the cooking for her own wedding day. "Some things a woman's got to do herself," she told Nathan, laughing when he protested that she shouldn't be working on such an important day. "Feeding the people I love is how I show it, Nathan. Wedding day or not, that's not changing." Tom served as best man, beaming with unabashed pride throughout the entire ceremony. Eli stood nearby in a borrowed suit, 2 sizes too large, grinning ear to ear, having grown in the months since the fire, into a young man who no longer apologized for taking up space in the world. Ellen Cassidy and the other ranching families filled the remaining seats, bound together, now not just by shared trauma, but by genuine friendship forged in the fires of a fight they'd won together. The preacher's words were simple, unhurried, matching the quiet dignity of 2 people who'd both buried a spouse and learned against every expectation that love could find its way back into a heart, even after grief had convinced them otherwise. "Nathan Cole," the preacher said, "do you take this woman?" "I do," Nathan said, before the preacher had even finished the question, drawing soft laughter from the gathered guests and a warm, teary smile from Clara herself. "And Clara Whitmore, do you take this man?" "I do," Clara said, equally quick, equally certain, her voice steady, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. When Nathan kissed his bride, the small crowd erupted into cheers loud enough to carry clear across the yard. And somewhere in the celebration that followed, Nathan found himself standing quietly beside Clara, near the kitchen doorway, watching the joyful chaos of their wedding feast unfold in the very room that had once held nothing but silence and grief. "I have something to show you," he said quietly, taking her hand. "Now. During our own wedding. Now." His voice had gone serious, though not troubled, something gentle and resolved in his expression. "Won't take but a minute." He led her upstairs, away from the noise and celebration below, down the hallway, to the door that had remained locked for 6 long years. The door Clara had never once tried to open, respecting his boundary, even in the months since she'd first understood what lay behind it. Nathan produced a key from his pocket, his hand steady, despite the weight of what he was about to do, and unlocked the door for the first time since Elizabeth's funeral. "Nathan, you don't have to." "I want to." He pushed the door open, revealing a room exactly as it had been left 6 years earlier. A woman's dresses still hanging in the wardrobe. A hairbrush resting on the dressing table. A room frozen in time, preserved like a shrine to a grief Nathan had never fully allowed himself to release. He stood in the doorway a long moment, Clara's hand still held tight in his, and something in his face shifted, softened, the last vestige of that locked-away grief finally beginning to ease. "I couldn't come in here for 6 years, he said quietly. "Couldn't bear to see it, couldn't bear to change it, couldn't bear to let anybody else near it either. Felt like moving a single thing would mean finally admitting she was really gone." He looked at Clara, something profound and grateful in his expression. "I don't feel that way anymore. Not because I love her any less, but because I finally understand grief doesn't have to mean living in a locked room forever. It can become something you carry with you, instead gentle and remembered, while you still make room to keep on living." Clara's eyes filled, moved beyond words by the trust he was extending her, the vulnerability of finally opening a door he'd guarded so fiercely for so long. "What do you want to do with it?" she asked softly. "Thought maybe you could help me decide. Together." He squeezed her hand. "Maybe some of it gets kept, gentle reminders of a woman who deserves to be remembered with love instead of buried in silence. And maybe some of it makes room for whatever we build together going forward. Children's room someday, if we're blessed that way. Or just space that belongs to us, instead of a memory frozen in place. I'd be honored to help you with that, Nathan. Whenever you're ready." He kissed her softly, gratefully, and together they stepped back out of the room, leaving the door open behind them for the first time in 6 years. Not closed away in grief, but open, breathing, ready to become part of a life that continued moving forward instead of standing still in mourning. They returned downstairs to a wedding feast still in full celebration, and nobody remarked on their brief absence, though Tom's knowing glance suggested he understood exactly what quiet, significant moment had just passed upstairs. The months that followed unfolded with the steady, contented rhythm of two people building a life together out of the wreckage both had once believed was permanent and unchangeable. Cole Ranch flourished under their combined care. Nathan's shrewd business sense paired with Clara's careful bookkeeping, the herds recovering fully from the sabotage, new contracts replacing the ones Holloway had maliciously destroyed, the whole operation running stronger and more profitable than it had in years. Marcus Holloway. They learned through occasional updates from territorial officials, faced substantial prison time once the full scope of his fraud across multiple territories came to light during subsequent investigation. His scheme, it turned out, had extended far beyond the 5 ranching families in their immediate community, reaching into at least 2 other counties where similar patterns of sabotage and fraudulent land acquisition had gone unchecked until Clara's documentation provided the first solid evidence connecting the crimes together. "You didn't just save our ranch," Nathan told her one evening, reading the latest update from Margaret Cole about the ongoing prosecution. "You stopped a man from destroying God knows how many more families before somebody finally caught him." "We stopped him," Clara corrected, same as she always did when he tried to credit her alone for what had clearly been a shared fight. "Every family who trusted us enough to bring their evidence forward, every witness who testified, every one of us who refused to face him alone. That's what actually stopped him, Nathan. Not any one person, but a community that finally chose to stand together instead of letting fear keep us isolated." The ranch hands, too, had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted when Clara first walked through the gate. Eli Parker, once a nervous boy who apologized for his own existence, had grown into one of Nathan's most trusted hands, given increasing responsibility as the months passed, his confidence blooming steady and genuine under the combined mentorship of a rancher who'd once been underestimated himself and a cook who'd never stopped believing in his worth. "Gonna make foreman one day, that boy," Tom remarked proudly, watching Eli direct a group of newer hands through a difficult cattle drive with calm, capable authority. "Never seen a young man come so far so fast." "Just needed somebody to believe in him," Clara said, watching with quiet satisfaction. "Same as anybody, I suppose." Even Rafe Dunlop, gruff and resistant as he'd once been to the changes Clara brought, had softened considerably. His early grumbling, long since replaced by genuine respect for a woman who'd proven through fire and courtroom battles alike that she possessed more courage and resourcefulness than he'd initially given her credit for. "Never apologized proper for how I acted when you first arrived," Rafe admitted gruffly one afternoon, helping Clara carry supplies into the kitchen. "Weren't fair of me judging you before I knew the first thing about you." "Water under the bridge, Rafe. We're all better for how things turned out." "Reckon we are." He set the supplies down, hesitating a moment longer than usual. "This ranch feels like a place worth staying now. Didn't always feel that way, if I'm honest. Felt like working for a ghost some years back before you came along and reminded Mr. Cole he was still among the living." Clara smiled, touched by the unexpected honesty. "High praise coming from you. Don't get used to it," Rafe said, though his mouth twitched with something close to a smile as he headed back out to his chores, and Clara found herself laughing softly at the echo of Nathan's own words from all those months ago, back when neither of them had yet understood how thoroughly they'd end up changing each other's lives. It was nearly a year after Clara's first arrival on an ordinary autumn evening, with the harvest safely gathered and the ranch settling into the quiet rhythm of approaching winter, that Nathan found her in the kitchen garden, tending the herbs she'd planted that very first week, and felt a wave of gratitude so profound it nearly stole the breath from his chest. "You look like a man with something on his mind," Clara said, glancing up from her work. "Just thinking." He crouched down beside her among the herbs, watching her hands move with the same steady competence they'd shown from the very first day. "About how different everything looks now compared to when you first walked up that road." "Good different, I hope. Best different I could have asked for." He took her hand, careful of the soil still clinging to her fingers. "I was a dead man walking when you found me, Clara. Rich, successful, completely alone, and so buried in grief I'd convinced myself that was just how the rest of my life would look. You didn't just bring warmth back into this house. You brought me back to life." Clara's eyes softened, moved by the raw honesty in his voice. "You did the same for me, you know. I walked up that road with nothing left but a broken suitcase and enough stubbornness to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Didn't know if I had anything left worth offering anybody. You gave me a place where my work mattered, where I could grieve my husband without forgetting how to hope for something more." "Any regrets?" Nathan asked, only half teasing. "Marrying a stubborn rancher who nearly got himself shot defending a hay barn and a fraud case. Not a single one." Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, the same way she had that first terrifying night after the barn fire. Except now, the gesture carried none of that earlier uncertainty, only the settled comfort of two people who'd chosen each other through fire and fraud, and every difficult thing in between. "I'd walk that same 3 miles 100 times over Nathan Cole if it meant ending up exactly here, exactly like this." They sat together in the garden as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, surrounded by herbs that had grown from nothing into something flourishing, in a house that had transformed from a monument to loneliness into a genuine home. And neither of them needed to say anything further, because everything that mattered had already been spoken, tested, and proven true through everything they'd survived together. Inside the house, the dining room that had once echoed with 6 years of silence now filled most evenings with the comfortable noise of a full household, Tom often staying for supper, Eli practically part of the family, by now occasional visits from Ellen Cassidy and the other ranching families who'd become genuine friends rather than mere allies in a shared fight. The locked room upstairs, once a shrine to frozen grief, had slowly transformed under Clara's gentle guidance into something new. Elizabeth's belongings carefully preserved in a cedar chest, treated with the respect and love they deserved, while the room itself had been repainted, refurnished, prepared quietly for whatever future the young couple might build together. That future arrived sooner than either of them expected when Clara discovered the following spring that she was carrying their first child, and told Nathan the news in the same kitchen where their story had first begun, standing at the very stove where she'd cooked that first transformative meal nearly 2 years earlier. Nathan's reaction stunned silence, followed by an unguarded joy that transformed his entire face, told Clara everything she needed to know before he'd even found the words to respond. "A baby," he said finally, voice thick with emotion. "Clara, we're going to have a baby." "We are." She laughed through sudden tears, overwhelmed by the moment. "Nathan Cole, are you crying?" "Man's allowed to cry over good news, same as bad," he said gruffly, though he made no effort to hide the tears gathering in his own eyes as he pulled her close, one hand resting protective and reverent against her still flat stomach. "This ranch is going to have a family again. A real one. Children running through these halls, filling up that empty dining room proper." "It was never truly empty," Clara said softly. "Not since the day I walked through that gate. No." Nathan agreed, holding her close in the kitchen that had witnessed the entire journey of their unlikely hard-won love. "I suppose it wasn't." Their daughter was born the following winter during a gentle snowfall that blanketed the ranch in soft white quiet, and they named her Elizabeth Grace Cole. Elizabeth, for the woman whose memory Nathan had finally learned to carry with peace instead of grief. Grace for the mercy and second chances that had brought Clara walking up that dusty road when Nathan least expected salvation to arrive, in the shape of a determined widow with nothing but a broken suitcase and unshakable resolve. Tom held the baby first outside the immediate family, tears openly streaming down his weathered face as he marveled at the tiny girl who represented everything the ranch had fought so hard to protect and rebuild. "Never thought I'd see this day," he said, voice thick with emotion, passing the baby carefully back to her exhausted, glowing mother. "Never thought this house would hear a baby's cry again after everything it went through. But here we are. Here we all are." Eli, now firmly established as Nathan's most trusted foreman in training, brought flowers from the garden Clara had first planted 2 years earlier, and stood awkwardly proud, beside the new parents, having grown from a frightened boy into a confident young man, who owed much of his transformation to the very family now welcoming new life into their home. "She's gonna grow up surrounded by people who love her something fierce," he said, looking down at the sleeping infant with wonder. "That's a good thing to be born into." "The best thing," Clara agreed, exhausted but radiant, looking between her daughter and her husband, with a joy so complete it seemed to fill every corner of the room that had once known nothing but silence and grief. Nathan sat beside his wife and daughter that evening, long after the well-wishers had gone home, and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, watching snow fall soft outside the window of the very room he'd once kept locked against 6 years of unbearable grief. He thought of the cracked plate that had started it all. The stubborn woman who'd walked 3 miles through brutal heat, refusing to be turned away, the fire and fraud and violence they'd survived together, the locked door he'd finally found the courage to open. He thought of every moment that had led him here, to this quiet room, this sleeping child, this woman who'd walked into his broken life and rebuilt it into something whole again. "Thank you," he murmured, more to the universe than to Clara specifically, though she stirred slightly beside him, exhausted, but awake enough to hear. For what? For everything. For walking up that road. For refusing to give up on a bitter, grieving man who didn't deserve a second chance at happiness. For fighting beside me instead of running when things got dangerous. For giving me this. He gestured to their sleeping daughter, to the room around them, to the entire transformed life they'd built together. "I was ready to spend the rest of my days alone in that silent house, Clara. Ready to let grief win completely. You didn't let that happen." "We didn't let that happen," Clara corrected gently, same as she always did, refusing to let him carry the credit alone the same way he refused to let her carry blame alone. "We saved each other, Nathan. That's what this whole journey was always about." Outside, the snow continued falling soft and steady over Cole Ranch, blanketing the land in quiet white peace, covering the scars of sabotage and fire and violence that had once threatened to tear everything apart, and inside the house that had transformed from a monument of grief into a genuine home. A family slept peacefully together, bound by love that had survived fire, fraud, gunfire, and 6 years of unbearable loneliness to become something unbreakable. The story of Nathan Cole and Clara Whitmore would be told for years afterward, throughout that stretch of Montana territory, not merely as a tale of a wealthy rancher who'd hired a cook, but as proof that even the deepest grief could make room for new love, that even the loneliest heart could learn to open again, and that sometimes the person who walks into your life carrying nothing but a broken suitcase turns out to be carrying exactly what your broken heart needed all along. A home they had both learned through fire and fear and hard-won victory was never truly built from wealth, land, or grand ambition. It was built from two people choosing again and again through every trial that tried to tear them apart to stay. And Nathan Cole and Clara Whitmore, having survived everything life had thrown against them, chose exactly that every single day for the rest of their lives together.